Hey everyone, I am standing on the north bank of the Rappahannock River in Stafford County, Virginia. You may be able to see behind me the city of Fredericksburg, and we are commemorating here with the American Battlefield Trust the 160th anniversary of the Fredericksburg campaign. Now, how do we get to Fredericksburg? Why Fredericksburg? It's a rather innocuous colonial city that dates back to the time of George Washington, but here in 1862, two armies are going to converge: Ambrose Burnside's Army of the Potomac and Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. And to talk more about why Fredericksburg is so important to both sides, I'm going to bring on my colleague Sarah Bierle. Sarah, come on and take it away.
Thanks, Dan. We want to kind of do a little bit of an overview. What's happening, and as Dan said, how the armies get here. So when we're looking at the Eastern Theater in the autumn of 1862, the Battle of Antietam, Battle of Sharpsburg has happened on September 17th, 1862. And while this does force the Confederate Army to retreat from their invasion of Maryland, there is not a crushing defeat of the Confederate Army. Robert E. Lee is able to slip away across the Potomac River. And President Lincoln really wants George B. McClellan, commander of the Union Army, to follow up on this success, fight again, defeat the Confederates again, ideally. But McClellan is inclined to not do that. He's going to sit for a while, something that McClellan is often criticized for. And this is going to lead to Lincoln looking for a replacement general. And the replacement general that he's going to choose is a man named Ambrose Burnside. And McClellan's going to find out on November 5th that he's going to be relieved of command. Burnside takes command of the Army of the Potomac on November 7th. Now this is very unpopular with the soldiers in the Army of the Potomac. They love McClellan. He's the general that built the Army of the Potomac. He led them on the peninsula. He led them at Antietam. He's extremely popular. So they have some doubts about Burnside. And Ambrose Burnside himself has doubts about, well, himself. He's not sure that he's cut out for Army command, but he decides he'd rather have command than it go to the other option. And the other option was General Joseph Hooker, who's, spoiler alert for next year, Hooker will get a chance at command with the Army of the Potomac, but not in the autumn of 1862. Now, Burnside needs to come up with a new strategy. Lincoln is looking for a victory. And one of the reasons Lincoln needs a victory is he's announced that preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And a military victory from federal forces is going to give weight to that promise of freedom that he is making. So Lincoln is pressuring generals in the Western Theater and also in the East for a victory before the end of the year. And Burnside is going to come up with an idea, and he wants to use the railroad. And that is part of the reason that he is going to shift his army toward the Fredericksburg area. Dan, do you want to join us and talk a little bit more about the railroad, and then we can talk about the Confederates?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to sum up what Sarah just mentioned, the two things that drive this campaign is politics with the upcoming Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln needs a victory to give that proclamation teeth, and logistics. Burnside has to get to Richmond before the end of the year. How does he do that? He has to move roughly about 120,000 men south from his position, roughly around the area of Warrenton, about 30 miles off to the northwest, to get to Richmond. How does he supply his army on the way south? He's sitting astride the Orange and Alexandria Railroad at the time, but it's an older line and runs away from his objective of Richmond. So he looks a little bit farther to the east and he sees the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. And you might, if you're watching this video and some of our other videos, you might be able to hear the railroad off in the distance as trains are still using the rail line that runs through Fredericksburg today. The Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac is a newer line, and it has the capacity to support his 120,000 man army. So Burnside decides that he's going to move to Fredericksburg, but he's going to need pontoons, which you can see over to our right, or a recreation of these pontoons to get across the Rappahannock, which is off to my right and just below me at the base of Stafford Heights. Burnside begins moving his army out of Warrenton toward Fredericksburg around the middle of November, and he actually steals a march on Robert E. Lee, and he's able to reach the heights here at Fredericksburg, or overlooking the city, before Lee really has time to react. But the pontoons are delayed, and Burnside is going to be stuck on the north bank of the Rappahannock as the Confederates begin to filter in from the Shenandoah Valley, Culpeper County off to our west, to take up a position west of Fredericksburg to block Burnside's route to the south. And for that march, I'm going to bring Sarah back onto the camera.
Thanks, Dan. Yes, so Robert E. Lee has to make a decision on how he's going to get his troops to Fredericksburg, and he initially considers a different location. He's thinking about setting up defensive lines along the North Anna River, which, as some of you may know, is quite a ways south of where we are at Fredericksburg now. And he's convinced by Jefferson Davis and then by unfolding circumstances that perhaps it would be better to come up to the Fredericksburg area, set up defensive lines here. So the 1st Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia is commanded by General James Longstreet, and they are the first to arrive here in the Fredericksburg area. They're going to take up a defensive position along the high ground, as Dan talked about, west of town, areas known as Marye's Heights, and the high ground out in that area. The 2nd Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia is commanded by Thomas Jonathan Jackson, who's probably better known by his nickname Stonewall. Now, Jackson is out in the Shenandoah Valley to the west. That's a long ways to march, but Jackson actually gets his army moving on the road toward Fredericksburg before he receives orders from Lee. So an interesting guess that he makes that turns out well for the Confederates. He's going to march south in the Shenandoah Valley. He'll cross Massanutten Mountain at New Market Gap. A lot of his troops will go through Thornton Gap as they're heading east, come through Culpeper and that area, and then when they arrive in the Fredericksburg area toward the end of November, Lee is going to have Jackson's Corps stretch along the Rappahannock River, so they're in the downriver area for about 18 to 20 miles down to the Port Royal area, because Lee does not know what Burnside's objective is at this point. He just knows that the Army of the Potomac is sitting on Stafford Heights, and who knows what they're planning next. So because Lee doesn't know where Burnside might plan to cross, he stretches his army out, and that does play into the situation as it unfolds on December 11th and 13th, which I'm sure we'll be talking about in some of the other videos. Now, I do want to point out, because a question that I sometimes hear is, why the pontoon bridges? Are there no bridges here at Fredericksburg? Well, that's kind of a yes and a no answer to the question. So there were bridges that go from the Stafford side of the river to the Fredericksburg side of the river in the pre-war years and even during the beginning of the war. But in the spring of 1862, Union troops come to the Fredericksburg area for the first time, and in an attempt to keep them from crossing the river, Confederates have burned those bridges. And those bridges have not been repaired. And that's the reason that these pontoon bridges, these floating portable bridges that Burnside is bringing with him, are going to be so important. And to talk about some of the fiascos with the arrival of the pontoon bridges, and to help answer the question as to why not just cross upriver, Dan Davis.
Thank you, Sarah. Burnside, again, has been blocked by Lee here at Fredericksburg, and we're getting into the latter part of November, early December of 1862. How does Burnside get across the Rappahannock and get to Richmond effectively? So Burnside looks upstream, looks off to the north. There's a slackwater navigation canal to the north, making things very difficult in that sector for to get his army across. He looks downstream toward Port Royal, but the problem at Port Royal is that the river widens in that area. It's blocked by Jackson's Corps, as Sarah mentioned. So after weighing these two options, upstream and downstream, Burnside decides that he is going to cross into the city itself. He knows that Lee's army is somewhat divided. There's a gap off to the south of the city, and he hopes to get across the river as quickly as he possibly can before the Confederates can react, push through the city, seize the heights beyond the town, and then take the Telegraph Road, or modern Route 1. And that will be his avenue of approach, his route directly into Richmond. But unfortunately for Burnside, events are not going to unfold that way. And what's going to happen, beginning, as Sarah mentioned, December 11th through the 13th, is going to become a major disaster for the Union Army here at Fredericksburg.
Kris Mackowski for the American Battlefield Trust, standing on the banks of the beautiful Rappahannock River in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And we're going to bring you fantastic coverage today for the anniversary. 160 years ago today, as the Union Army tried to get across this river and drive the Confederates out of their position, suffering the most devastating loss the Army of the Potomac will suffer throughout the Civil War. We've got all kinds of on-location coverage for you today. We've got Kris White behind the camera right now. He'll be coming on in just a little moment to talk about part of this story. We've got Dan Davis coming in just a few minutes. We've got Sarah K. Bierle coming in just a few minutes. We're going to have all kinds of great on-location stuff for you today. I want to urge you to share this on your Facebook page. Share this with your friends. Get people to join in with us today because we've got lots of cool stuff going on. Let me get us up here to the banks of the river because, as you know, Ambrose Burnside is someone we think of as someone who is not the most brilliant man in the entire Army of the Potomac, not the sharpest tool in the shed, right? Except that he gets here by stealing a march on Robert E. Lee. He gets over here and knows he's got to get across this river. He wants to take possession of the town and the transportation network that's here. And that'll allow him to move his army on toward Richmond, using the roads, using the railroads, even being able to take advantage of some of the protection that the river might be able to offer him. That's why Fredericksburg itself became such an important hub, because of this transportation network that converges here. Burnside gets to the city, wants to take advantage of that, and heads south. He pulled the head fake on Robert E. Lee, who was expecting him to continue down around the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. But he gets here, can't get across the river. He knows the bridges are destroyed, and he calls back to Washington to ask for pontoon bridges to get sent here so he can construct bridges across this river. In fact, we're standing at one of the locations where he will eventually build one of those bridges. So, of course, Henry Halleck, General-in-Chief of the Army, just a fabulously mediocre guy at his job. He's like, oh, yes, pontoon bridges. Yes, I'll get you some. And he doesn't bother to hurry up at all. And so Burnside gets here, and that's just when the orders get to the pontooniers, and I wanted to use that word today, pontooniers, to finally get into motion. So he's delayed. And Robert E. Lee, nobody's fool, understands what's going on, and he's going to react in just a moment. And to come on and talk about that, I'm going to ask Sarah K. Bierle to get Robert E. Lee here to Fredericksburg to counter Ambrose Burnside on the far side of the river.
Thanks, Kris. Yes, the Confederates have to come, and they're going to attempt to block this Union movement to the south along the railroad, as Kris was describing. So Robert E. Lee initially was looking for a different defensive position. He kind of toyed with the idea of going down by the North Anna River. Jefferson Davis did not like that idea. Jefferson Davis being president of the Confederacy, he felt that would be letting the Union Army get a little too close to Richmond. So instead, the First Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, commanded by General James Longstreet, is going to set up a defensive position here around Fredericksburg, particularly on the high ground beyond the town. They're going to move into this position, and in mid-November, the Second Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, commanded by Thomas Jonathan Jackson, better known by his nickname Stonewall, will begin moving from the Shenandoah Valley over to the Fredericksburg area. Lee will join the armies, or join the troops here, and begin setting up position near Fredericksburg. Now, it's not clear to Robert E. Lee what the Union Army will do next. He realizes they're going to have to cross the Rappahannock River, but he doesn't know where in the Fredericksburg area. So when Jackson's Corps arrives, he's going to send Jackson's Corps along the Rappahannock River, about 20 miles to the south, stringing them out all along that distance, in hopes that when the Union Army begins their crossing effort, they will then be able to concentrate the other Confederate forces to that area. So Lee recognizes the Union Army will have to cross the river, but he doesn't know where. And on the morning of December 11th, it's going to start becoming clear. And we'll bring our, Dan, are you up next?
I believe I'm up next.
Dan Davis is up next to start talking about the crossings.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. Is this good? It's gonna have to be. Thank you. Great technical crew here, as always. Now, as Sarah mentioned, Lee's able to concentrate his army on the south bank of the Rappahannock, effectively blocking Ambrose Burnside's route south. So Burnside has been blocked here at Fredericksburg. He's got to find a way to get across the Rappahannock, get on the same side of the river as the enemy. So he's going to look upstream. No go. There's a slackwater navigation canal above the city, going to make crossing very difficult in that area. He's going to look downstream at Port Royal, as Sarah just mentioned, about 20 miles south of Fredericksburg, southeast of the city. Once again, a no-go. The river widens there dramatically, and he's blocked there by Jackson's course. So Burnside surmises that his best option available is to cross immediately in front of the city, get across the river from Stafford Heights, which you can see behind me, get into the city, drive through the city as quickly as possible, take the heights west of town, take the Telegraph Road, that's his inside track to the Confederate capital at Richmond. Burnside surmises that if he can get across quickly enough, he's going to be able to take Lee by surprise. So on the morning of December the 11th, the pontooniers, as Kris mentioned, are going to begin moving the pontoon boats down from Stafford Heights, and they're going to set up at 3 separate crossings here at the upper crossing in Fredericksburg, down at the city docks, which is known as the middle crossing, and the lower crossing, or Franklin's crossing, which is just below the city. Now, back here in the city itself, Robert E. Lee has posted or directed one of his division commanders, Lafayette McLaws, to post a brigade of Mississippians, 4 regiments from Mississippi, commanded by William Barksdale. William Barksdale has 2 objectives on the morning of December the 11th. 1, monitor the enemy movement on the other side of the river and send word back to Lee if there's any type of Federal activity. And number 2, should the Federals attempt to cross, Barksdale, within reason, is to delay that crossing as long as possible. Now, as we mentioned, the pontooniers, the engineers are going to begin working early on the morning of December the 11th, dragging the pontoon boats down from Stafford Heights and setting up right here behind me. That you can see, the area that you see down here and across the river from the slope off my right shoulder. This activity is going to go on for the next few hours. Obviously, Barksdale's Mississippians who are posted up here in the houses as pickets is going to hear that activity. Word's going to go back up through the chain of command, and a little bit before dawn or so, 2 cannon shots are going to ring out from the west, Confederate artillery signaling the Army of Northern Virginia that the Federals are indeed crossing and for the Army to concentrate. And a little after 5 a.m., the Mississippians up here on the riverbank are going to open fire on the bridge builders and on the engineers, and the bridge builders and engineers are going to run back over to the safety of the North Bank under cover of 2 New York regiments commanded by a fellow named Samuel Zook. You may be familiar with him. He's going to die at Gettysburg on July 2nd, 1863. Now, Burnside, to cover the engineers and the pontooners, is going to place approximately 147 cannons up on top of Stafford Heights under the direction of Henry Hunt. 147 guns to begin the day, over 180 will end the day. They are to cover the bridge builders and provide suppressing fire should the Confederates offer any type of resistance. And as soon as the engineers get back to the north bank of the river, the guns open up, the Mississippians take shelter in the houses in the basements, the guns fall silent, Mississippians reemerge as the bridge builders come back out onto the pontoon bridge, and they open fire again. And this cycles itself through. These events cycle through the course of the morning and into the early to mid-afternoon hours. And by around 2:30 in the afternoon, Burnside has been delayed for the better part of the last 8 to 9 hours, and he has to look about for another option. He's got to get these bridges built, especially here at the upper crossing, and he looks to Henry Hunt. How do we do this? And Hunt comes up with a rather ingenious idea. Let's put Union infantry in some of these pontoon boats, row them across the river, drive the Confederates out of the houses here at the upper end of the city, and establish a bridgehead so that we can complete the construction of the bridge. And for that riverine crossing, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kris White. Kris?
Hey everybody, thanks for watching. We're on YouTube, we're on Facebook. I'm going to get Chris Mackowski, our cameraman, out of the road here because we are down live along Sophia Street, also known as Water Street at the time of the American Civil War. And we really thank you for watching this. Please share this with your friends, with your family. If I sound terrible, I have a horrible cold right now, so I apologize for my voice. But we're going to bear through it. Because as we're standing out here today, let's bring it from the 500,000 feet down to the 500 feet. So we have this river crossing taking place here at Fredericksburg. We have Union soldiers who are across the river from us. At the time of the war, this river would have been about 400 feet wide. Now, in the early 20th century, the Rappahannock River is dammed up at the Embry Dam, so that's going to narrow the channel. They're also going to try to blast out the channel because it gets a lot of sediment and mud. If you've ever been down here at low tide, you can actually see, and during drought conditions, you can actually, at some points, walk across the Rappahannock River, which also begs the point, why didn't Burnside just walk across the river here? Well, this has to be a military crossing. Remember, we need to cross over men, horses, materiel, artillery, everything that you bring along with them. So we bring those temporary bridges. We talked about these pontoons a lot. Pontoons are temporary bridges that are going to be placed in the river behind us. They're boats that are going to be placed in the water, turned sideways, and then placed at distances across the river. Across that, you'll start putting planking, and then you have a ready-made bridge using ropes and other things to anchor it down. So as you go down the Rappahannock River from the upper to the middle to the lower crossing site, you will have the river widen dramatically from 400 feet down to about 420, down to 440 feet. And then as you go farther and farther down towards the Chesapeake, it will expand to over 1,000 feet wide down at places like Port Royal. So we have to get across the river here. So these men, these engineers, these construction workers essentially will come down here. They will go out onto this flat boat, and when their boat's they're onto their flat bridge, and when their bridge is about 200 feet into the water, about halfway across the river, that's when William Barksdale begins to fire upon the Federals. This is around 5 to 5:15 in the afternoon. Or, I'm sorry, in the morning. If you read some of the accounts from the time, their watches are going to be wildly different. One guy thinks they start firing at 3 o'clock, one at 4 o'clock, another's at 5:15. We'll call it about 5:15 because we don't have standardized time like we think of it today. So these pontooniers put those bridges out into the water. They're shot down left and right. One man said that it took a lot of bravery to go out under these bridges with just planks in your hands and tools and no weapons. But time and again, these pontooniers went out there, these engineers. Well, eventually, when, as Dan pointed out, Henry Jackson Hunt comes up with this idea to put men and boats together and cross the river, this is going to be an ingenious idea. We look back on D-Day, June 6, 1944. We look at Anzio. We look at the island hopping campaign during World War II. Yeah, those are all great ideas because they have Higgins boats, they have landing craft, everything. Here, we have no specialized training for this. We're coming up with it on the ground, and we're also using boats that aren't designed to carry men across the river. They're meant for buoyancy. They're not meant for speed. So these men who are going to come across on this riverfront, it's going to be a just hellacious battle here. So at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Norman J. Hall's brigade of the Union 2nd Army Corps are voluntold that they are going to go across the river down here. And down to the riverfront will come the 7th Michigan Infantry, commanded by a guy named Henry Baxter, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Baxter. As Baxter comes down to the riverfront, his 157 men jump into boats, expecting the engineers at this point to help ferry them across the river. Well, as the Wolverines jump into the boats, out of the boats go the engineers. They don't want any of this. So the Michiganders start pushing the boats into the water, and they start to row. Since they're not trained seamen, they're going to start to spin their boats in the water. Some will start floating downstream. Others will slowly plod across this water because the pontoon boats are flat-nosed. They're not meant to go across any piece of water with any sort of speed. They're going to go across, and it's going to be like forcing a crossing here. And once the boats get about halfway out into the river, men are falling left and right. But once they reach that halfway point, we start to see that the Confederate fire slackens. Because where we're standing up here is actually on a plateau. But the Confederates, who are actually across the street from us, where we're going to walk in a moment, can't actually see down into the river. So once the Federals get closer to the enemy, it seems counterintuitive, they're actually safer because the Confederates can't see them. But halfway across the river, Henry Baxter shot through the chest, and he tells his men to turn back. His second in command, Thomas Hunt, says, no, keep going forward. And Hunt's men now will land here, they will pour out of the boats, and they will start to go in and around Sophia Street where we are. And they are going to start fighting house by house, street by street. Because what William Barksdale has done, we're going to take a walk here up into Fredericksburg, what William Barksdale has done is set up what we would consider today a defense in depth. He set up his first line of resistance here, and this is Sophia Street, also called Water Street because it's along the water. Now, he will have men down here from Mississippi, Behind Kris Mackowski will be the terminus of the northern end of Fredericksburg, and that will be Floridians under the command of David Lang. Keep moving this way, Kris, to get you out of the road. And then inside the houses down here, inside the warehouses, the houses, any place that you could think will be Mississippians. There'll be 2 to 20 men per building. They'll put up, they'll dig rifle pits behind us. They're actually going to lay traps. They will be in a house just up the street from us. And whenever they're inside of the Welford House, some of the Michiganders and some Massachusetts men will come up to a door and they'll see this door is locked and they'll kick it in. And on the other side of the door, Confederates lying in wait. So the Confederates have set up a main line of resistance, our first line of resistance here. Then the next street back we'll walk to here in a moment is Caroline Street. We'll consider that Main Street here in Fredericksburg. That's where a lot of the confectionaries will be. There's 13 confectionaries here in Fredericksburg. They have a pretty big sweet tooth. Gaslit streets, sidewalks, everything. It's a pretty nice city as it's growing up here in the 1860s, a city of about 5,040 people. But then on that next street back there, we'll have our second line of resistance. And then even farther back along Princess Anne Street, we'll have our third line of resistance. And if you're wondering where the names of Fredericksburg comes from, this is actually not named after Frederick the Great, like most people think. It's actually named after the son of King George II, his not-so-loved son, Frederick. Frederick will die in a freak accident, I think, playing tennis. But it is named after the House of Hanover, so you see Caroline, Princess Anne, George, all of that. So this is actually named after the House of Hanover, who's the ruling house of Great Britain, whenever this is a colonial city founded in 1728. So into this area will come the Michigan troops. They will pour into here, start going into the houses, start clearing out, and some of these are original houses, clearing out the Confederates. On the opposite bank of the river, we will still have Union soldiers watching. This is the greatest panorama of the war, according to historian Gary Gallagher. They could see up and down the river. They're watching their friends die out in these boats. They're seeing them fight house by house, street by street. And more men will come across this area. That'll be the 19th Massachusetts of Captain Henry Weymouth, under the command of Captain Henry Weymouth. They will move into here, and we'll have more Union soldiers fighting into this area. And the Union soldiers don't really have many orders other than to establish this bridgehead. Now, while all this is happening, the engineers go back to work. As they go back to work, they're undercover now because the Confederate infantry aren't picking them off on the bridges. They're focused now on the Michiganders, the Bay State men, and then down at another crossing, some New York men coming across as well, the 89th New York, Harrison Fairchild's 89th New York. But these men will make it up into this area here, into a blind alley. We're walking along Hawk Street here in Fredericksburg. And I'm going to jump behind the camera for a minute just to give you an idea of where we are and to give Kris a quick break. And we are walking up through this area. And they'll come up along into a blind alley along Hawk Street as they make their way towards Princess Anne Street. And as they come into this blind alley over here, the Michiganders will come to ground, and this is where they're going to stop. Some of the men from Massachusetts will actually go onto the other side of the street. The palm trees were not here at the time, nor was that house. And they will start moving up into some of the backyards over on the other side of the street. And then they'll be faced off at this intersection up here. This is the intersection of Caroline Street and Hawk Street. This will become the deadliest intersection in Fredericksburg. So at this point, we have more Massachusetts state soldiers coming across here, and that will be the 20th Massachusetts Infantry. Even though one of the bridges is already complete, the Bloody 20th as they are known, today we call them the Harvard Regiment, they will come across in boats in very flamboyant style, pour out of the boats, and march in column right to this point. And standing here will be Acting Major George Macy. He's going to run into Thomas Hunt, the commander of the 7th Michigan. The two of them are going to exchange words. And basically, Macy's going to tell Hunt, hey, get your Michiganders moving forward. Get those Wolverines moving. Hunt's like, no. We're good. We've already established a bridgehead. We're not moving. Macy says, no, we're not moving. So as this impasse is going on, there are Confederates legitimately across the street listening to what's happening. As they're listening to this idiocy, they know that the Federals are going to attack at some point. Then across the river, they send word for some more orders. They send back to their division commander a guy named Oliver Otis Howard, the pious but vapid Oliver Otis Howard, probably one of the worst combat leaders in the American Civil War. Brave to a fault, but yeah, I don't want to follow him to water. But Howard's eventually going to say something along the lines of push forward. He doesn't tell them where to go, who to go, what to do. And so Macy and Hunt have these orders now. They look at each other. Hunt says, I'm not moving and I outrank you. Macy says, well, I'll go forward and you can go to hell with your regiment. And into the intersection will go the 20th Massachusetts. The 20th, as they come up into this intersection, the Mississippians who were in this area already know they're coming. And Company I, who is leading the way, commanded by a captain named Henry Abbott, who leaves us a fantastic diary and letters of the war, his men will charge straight through the intersection while the rest of the 20th cordons off this area. This is the first urban combat we're seeing here, large-scale urban combat in the Eastern Theater. The Union Army and the Confederate Army are not trained for urban combat. They are going to do a lot of different things during the war. Fight in open fields. They're going to have to do river crossings, but they're not trained for urban combat. We do see urban combat in the Revolutionary War at places like Quebec. We'll also see it at First and Second Trenton. We'll see it during the Mexican-American War, and we'll see it in the Civil War, but in the Western Theater, places like Cynthiana and Carthage, Missouri. We don't see it here in the Eastern Theater really on large scale until we see this battle here. You can call the Philippi Races a street fight, but it's more of a running battle than anything. But now, the Mississippians, who are thinking outside the box, commanded by 41-year-old William Barksdale, who's not a West Point graduate, has to figure out where the high ground is here in this urban combat sector. What do? They get into the second and third stories of these buildings down here. And we have Confederates firing down into this intersection. Within this intersection here of Caroline Street and Hawk Street, 97 of the 20th Massachusetts will fall. One man said that 15 of his comrades were buried in one of the corners here, all buried after being killed in this intersection. What happens is the 20th, the first platoon of Company I goes charging straight forward, and they go deeper into the city. The rest of the regiment starts to actually wheel to the left, the right, and go straight and seal off this intersection. And then men will start to go into the houses. Now, you would think the Confederates have a pretty good advantage here because they're inside of the houses. But you'll notice down here, and these are private homes, they're clapboard, many of them. Mini balls will rip right through them, as will the artillery shells. Now, the artillery shells ripping through them have created new portals for some of these men to fire through. But when the mini balls fire through, splinters will come through. They'll hit the men. They'll be wounded not only by lead, but they can be wounded by glass that's flying out of these windows. They can be wounded by wood coming and hitting men. It's just going to be a nasty place to be. But eventually, this intersection is sealed off. And the first line of resistance has to give way. Then the second line of Confederate resistance will give way. Eventually, the mile-and-a-quarter riverfront down here that the city of Fredericksburg spans, the Union soldiers will take over about 1,110 feet of it, and then keep expanding and keep expanding and keep expanding. Kris?
I can't overestimate enough or underestimate enough on just how vital Barksdale's action is. Lee wants him to buy a couple hours. And so once he's able to do that, word comes down from his commander, Lafayette McLaws, to Barksdale to pull back. But McLaws is having such success at delaying the Union crossing that he ignores the order. And he's going to be able to continue this delaying action over the course of the full day. Why is that important? Well, as Kris mentioned earlier, or as Sarah mentioned earlier, Stonewall Jackson's corps is stretched 25 miles to the south of here. We only have James Longstreet's corps occupying the Confederate line at this point. So this is going to be much needed time that Lee is going to be able to consolidate his position. Except that he doesn't. Lee is still not entirely convinced that this is going to be Burnside's main effort. He's surprised that Burnside isn't using more strength to get across the river, but Burnside himself is aghast that he can't get across the river. At one point he says, our entire army is being held by the throats by a group of sharpshooters. That's how effective that this delaying effort is. Now, it's also important to note that Lee has been completely flummoxed by Burnside up to this point. He allowed the bridges to get halfway across the river before those signal guns went off because that commits the Federals to crossing here. Up to this point, Lee hasn't known where they're going to cross. So once they finally get invested, they finally get across, Lee's still not quite sure that this is going to be the main crossing. So Barksdale's delay becomes super important as time continues to go on, because Lee's going to then start to figure out how to actually deal with this. This fighting is going to go on throughout the streets here all day long, until finally James Longstreet will send a peremptory order through McLaws to Barksdale to pull back to the main line, which from where we're at is almost 1,000 yards off to my left along Marye's Heights. And so Barksdale will buy a full day for Lee before he finally pulls out. Now, I also want to go back to another point Kris made about how the fact that the armies have not trained for this. So again, when I mentioned earlier about the common misperception about Burnside is he's not the sharpest tool in the shed, look at how much he has had to rewrite the rules of war throughout this engagement. First riverine crossing under fire. First urban combat here for this army. They've never trained for that before. First time we've had to bombard our own city. And so Burnside's making this up as he goes. Final point I want to make here before I ask Kris to come back on is that Burnside didn't want any of this to begin with. He had gotten to the river, he had gotten stalled, he'd looked at the options that Dan laid out earlier, and he wanted to call a timeout. But because of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is supposed to go into effect on January 1st, Lincoln forces Burnside to do something. And so as the day goes on, as this campaign goes on, he's forced into a funnel of decision making that leads him to worse and worse choices. He's trying to make the best choices he can. He's trying to rewrite the rules of war as he goes, but he's finding himself backed into a corner until finally, when he gets bogged down into a type of fighting they've never experienced before, he is completely flummoxed. And so as his army floods across and gets this beachhead, establishes its presence in Fredericksburg, Burnside's not going to know what to do. He hasn't thought that far ahead at this point. And so his decision making will continue to get more and more limited. We're going to take a walk through this town here and talk a little bit more about the implications of what's going on. Kris?
Burnside not thinking that far ahead. I mean, you could do a hashtag with that one. So we're going to cross. This is Caroline Street. This is essentially Main Street here. I'm checking out some of your comments here. Hey, Darren, joining us from the UK, one of our good friends here. And as you look around here, one of the things I like to point out as we come through Fredericksburg is this part of the town. So if you drive through Fredericksburg, if you've never been here, it's actually a beautiful town. At the time of the war, it has a wartime population of about 5,040 people. We don't know how many people were here during the battle because there was a federal occupation from April until August of 1862. That's a first federal occupation. And some people leave. Specifically, the people who leave in great droves are the African Americans in the area. The enslaved population who are in the area, they self-emancipate themselves and they head over to the Union armies. They'll do the same thing during the Fredericksburg campaign. In fact, if you look at a lot of the photographs from the time of the winter encampment of 1862-63, you'll see pictures of like William Gamble. He's made famous fighting with John Buford at first day at Gettysburg. And he will have a black servant with him, as will other Union officers, because these are newly emancipated people who are now finding employment with the Union Army. So we estimate there's maybe 1,000 people in Fredericksburg during the battle. Now keep in mind, when the Union Army arrives here, there's almost 3 weeks between the start of the battle, their arrival and the start of the battle. So some people do come back. There's a large refugee camp we know out at the Salem Church, which is about 6 miles to the west of us. It's still operated today by the National Park Service. It's a National Park Service unit. It's a really cool site, site of a battle in May of 1863. And then you look around this area and you'll see historic homes. Not all of these are historic up here. And you'll notice that it's very much a colonial city. But if you drive through Fredericksburg today and you come down Caroline Street, you go up Princess Anne Street, as you start on the south end of the city, and then you go to the middle and then to the north where we are, you'll notice that the south and the north end of the city have houses like this. But the middle part of the city have a lot of homes as well as businesses from the 1930s, 40s, 50s. That's the area of the town that was hit heavily during the bombardment. It will take until the 1950s for this area to economically recover. That's 90 years after the battle for it to economically recover. And not until the 1960s does this area get its wartime population back to what it was during the Civil War era. So this area is very much hit by the hard hand of war. And you can follow that right down the I-95 corridor from Fredericksburg to Richmond to Petersburg, where even in Petersburg today, you can still see row houses that were destroyed during the war that have never been rebuilt. Looks like Kris has something to say.
Yeah, one of the other kind of cool things about the layout too is, we talked about that transportation hub, and so the buildings along the river, you had a lot of warehouses. It's a really industrial area. You come up the next street, you get into the business district where you've got lots of shops and stores, Main Street, as Kris had mentioned earlier. And then you get a street up and you get into the more residential area. So you're kind of getting away from all the work that's down by the river, centered around that transportation hub. And so you can still see part of that character of the city today. It's really neat that you can kind of come tap into those multi-layers of history from the colonial area through the Revolution and up through the Civil War area and today. The colonial history of this city is just fantastic. John Paul Jones, the naval hero, had lived here. Hugh Mercer, one of the early martyrs of the Revolution, was here. James Monroe practiced law here. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson both visited here. So, of course, Washington grew up right across the river.
George's mom lived here for the last 17 years of her life.
His mom
sister's
lived here. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
I mean, just lots of great history. So we're going to walk through town here a little bit more and take a look at some of that.
So to bring you back to our story here, what we now have is this intersection is now sealed off by the 20th Massachusetts, and this is a resistance point. Now we have the Company I, or at least one platoon of it, being led by Henry Abbott, charging deeper into the city. Abbott, remember, doesn't really have any specific orders. No one really does, other than to push forward. And that's exactly what he does. So as Abbott pushes deeper into the city, he's going to reach Princess Anne Street. But as he does so, he too is going to find that he is running into basically traps laid by the Confederates. They've cut holes in some of the fences, or firing through them. They're going to be in basements, firing out from those areas. In fact, there was, after the city is seized by the Federals, these Union soldiers go into one of the houses, and one of the walls had been completely blown out of it. And an officer comes by and says, "Hey guys, it wouldn't be a bad idea for you to get out of this house that's about to fall over." And as they all come out of the house, they found almost 30 dead Confederates inside of that house. And they realized just why it was so devastated. It's because it was a nest of Confederates, obliterated essentially. And this town will be really devastated. But Abbott will make it up to this point. This is Princess Anne Street. Dan's pointing the camera towards the south. I know Kris wants to talk about the Douglas Gordon house here in a moment. But you're looking actually here in a moment kind of uphill. And I know we're looking into the sun. This is the tough part of shooting this time of day. But if you're looking uphill there, and what you're looking at is the high ground. Fredericksburg actually sits on a plateau. And William Barksdale's headquarters is just about a quarter mile to the south of us at a place called the Market House. It was built in 1816, and it was where they had the market. Today it's a Fredericksburg Area Museum, great museum. Feel free to stop by there if you're ever in Fredericksburg. But Barksdale will establish his headquarters there in the center of the city on the third line of his resistance. So he is able to send men to the north and to the south. To the north, he'll send Floridians into the south because he has some flexibility. But ironically, states' rivalry get in the way, and these poor Floridians aren't given any room in the city to fight. They're actually on the outskirts of the city in open land. And in fact, the Floridians are in such a poor position to the south of us, Captain William Marye refuses to fire on the Federals. And you know why? Because he found out if you fire at the Federals, they'll fire back at you. And so Marye just sits there, and the Mississippians are screaming at him, "Fire, fire, fire." And they're like, no, you guys have the houses and warehouses. We're in an open field. We're not doing that. So eventually Marye and some of his men are cut off. To the north of the town, the Floridians are also in a bad place. And their captain, David Lang, he is actually going to be hit by some rubble from a falling chimney which he was standing nearby. And about half of his company takes him and runs off to the rear. So the fastest way to get off the field is to take your wounded officer with you. But Abbott, as he comes up here from the 20th Massachusetts, will actually turn down this road and go up towards that high ground, that little plateau, where he runs into his Harvard roommate, a man named Lane Brandon. And when he arrives at that point, they don't know it really, but they're facing off against each other. Old roommates, old rivalries coming here to a head at Fredericksburg. Later on, the two will figure out that they actually fought against each other because they send letters between each other, I think between his aunt, between Lane Bryant's aunt. Brandon refuses to pull off the line here, in fact. 3 times they have to send orders to him, and eventually they say, we will court-martial you and arrest you if you don't take your men off the field, because he didn't want to give up the fight here. And that's the fight here of the Mississippians. Barksdale will hold this city for an entire day. And Barksdale will have to wait until darkness. As Kris mentioned, there's 1,000 yards of open fields leading out towards Marye's Heights, which we'll see later on today if you join us for later on in our coverage. But down in this area, what we're seeing here are the Federals writing their own manual of how to fight into the city, and the Confederates doing the same thing. They're improvising. Eventually, the city will be seized around darkness on the evening of December the 11th. And this throws off Burnside's entire timetable. Burnside wanted to move across his army on the 11th, make assaults on the 12th. Now he has to move across on the 12th and make assaults on the 13th. And in the meantime, the city itself will be sacked by the Federals. The Federals will lay waste to Fredericksburg. Some of the Federals will try to save it. There will actually be fires here in Fredericksburg, and some of the Philadelphia volunteer firefighters who were firefighters before the war, specifically from Joshua Owen's brigade, the same ones who defended the stone wall at Gettysburg on July 3rd, 1863, they will try to put out some of the fires. While other men will go into houses. They'll steal alligators. They'll steal wedding dresses. They're going to bring pianos out into the road and start to play it. And you have to think to yourself, this is horrible that they're doing this to a city. But if you put yourself in the shoes of the Federal soldiers for a moment, and this isn't justifying what they're doing, but think about them for one moment. They had been within 6 miles of Richmond earlier in the year. Then they had been pushed back to the gates of Washington. They had victory ripped from their grasp time and again on the peninsula. They won at Antietam, but then don't follow up that victory. And now here on December the 13th, they've watched their friends come across this river and the greatest panoramic of the war and watch them be shot down by these Confederates. They've unleashed their wrath of the last 6 months on the city of Fredericksburg. One man will call it the most Goth of Goths. So it's a terrible thing that happens to the people here in Fredericksburg. And in fact, relief foundations will be found in the North and the South to try to rebuild Fredericksburg in the midst of the war.
And Marcina Patrick, the provost marshal, is absolutely beside himself as he's trying to put a damper on all that looting. It's one of the darkest chapters in the history of the American Army. And even as he goes from cluster of soldiers to cluster of soldiers, they'll stop as long as he's there. And as soon as he leaves, the looting begins again. The officers do nothing to try to stop what their men are doing. They share that frustration. They've seen how hard it was to get across this river. They've seen men fall. They are ready for revenge. And unfortunately, they take it out on this city. Now imagine if you're one of those 1,000 civilians that's still here and how horrific that experience must be as you're seeing your town get looted and burned around you. So it's absolute pandemonium. In the meantime, Burnside actually comes across the river to try to figure out what he's going to do. As I mentioned earlier, he hasn't really thought ahead. He figured he'd get across the river and it would scare Robert E. Lee out of his position, and then he'd start moving south. And then, of course, Robert E. Lee's still there, and so he's not sure what to do. Should he cross his whole army overnight? Should he wait until the morning? How should he attack? What should he do? He's completely flummoxed, and so he'll waste precious time. So all that time that Barksdale bought then gets compounded by a whole bunch of time that Burnside is going to waste. The night of the 11th into the 12th as Burnside tries to figure out what to do. One of the officers that makes his headquarters across on this side of the river is the vapid but pious Oliver Otis Howard, who will make his headquarters here in the Douglas House. This house is first actually occupied by Alfred Sully, one of the brigadiers. He occupies the house because it belongs to his brother-in-law. It is an opulent mansion full of beautiful, beautiful paintings, a massive library. There's actually a whole series of very expensive mirrors in there. And Sully places a guard there so that nobody ruins his brother-in-law's house. In fact, many of the paintings that are in there were painted by Sully's father himself, including a painting of Sully himself when Sully was 3 or 4 years old. So because the house is not destroyed, when Howard finally comes across the river to get the lay of the land, he takes over and uses his headquarters. The house also happens to be full of a lot of provisions. The drawing room in particular is full of lots of sugar, flour, baking goods, and a lot of other supplies like that. Someone somewhere decides to bake Oliver Otis Howard a pie. and then someone leaves it on the windowsill to cool off, and lo and behold, some enterprising young soldier snatches Howard's pie. And I guess since he only has one arm, he can't grab a hold of it to save it from its escape. So that's a little bit of one of those human interest stories here, and why the Gordon house does survive in a neighborhood that otherwise gets a lot of abuse. Sarah?
Thanks, Chris. I wanted to jump on, and that's a perfect segue because I had a couple of human interest stories. We've been talking about the plundering, the destruction that happened here in Fredericksburg, and I came across a couple stories that would have happened in this area. So one comes from an officer in the 19th Massachusetts, and he says that some of his men went into a house and they found a barrel of molasses, and they decided to fill their canteens with molasses. And when I was reading that, I had to stop and think about how sticky molasses is. I like to bake, and molasses, it seems like every time I use it, it gets everywhere. And that's exactly what it says in this officer's writing. He says that that entire house got covered in molasses. And then I was thinking about those sticky canteens as the soldiers head out into battle in the coming days. There's other stories about, as Chris said, provisions getting taken, and soldiers are looking for food. They're looking for that revenge, as has been talked about, and sometimes they're just kind of looking for souvenirs. In the last 2 minutes, you've heard Henry Abbott's name, officer in the 20th Massachusetts, mentioned several times, and he's a rather upstanding citizen on most days, but when he's here in Fredericksburg, he goes souvenir hunting. He's looking for specific things to send back to his mother and his siblings back home, and he's disappointed, if I remember correctly, that he doesn't find silver things like silver hairbrushes, but he takes books. He likes to read, so he steals some books from Fredericksburg. So these are the type of things that are happening. Sometimes scenes of intense anger and in this destruction. Other times it's almost more curiosity that's happening. There's a lot of human interest stories that happen once Fredericksburg has been taken over by the Union soldiers and in that period before we get to the next part of the fighting.
Yeah, I was surprised that Chris didn't point out, one of the brothels that were down here, because I know that's always on his mind. But one of the places across the street might have been one of the wartime era brothels, allegedly. And with that, Sarah, I just want to add a couple things that items do actually arrive back in Fredericksburg. There are soldiers, I'm glad you brought up, they're picking through things, and Marcina Patrick, the provost marshal, the military police, is going to say something along the lines of this army is a rabble when it's here. He's also known as the greatest living fossil of the Cenozoic era, according to some other officers. But Patrick will come down here and try to stop this sacking of the city. And after the war, things will start to arrive back here, where people will start to send things back and, kind of feel bad for taking what they did. So some things do make their way back here to Fredericksburg. But in the end, the city of Fredericksburg is taken by the Federals. Let's bring it back to our overarching story. We have about 30,000 Federals that will eventually end up in this city that is meant to hold about 5,000 people. Today, today's population of Fredericksburg is about 27,000 people. So there's even more people at the time of the war coming across just in the Union Army than there are here today. To the south of us, at our next stop where we're going to head down to the south end of the field, we have 60,000 Federal soldiers move across. So we have 90,000 Federals moving across 6 bridges, and it took the fighting here in the city to establish those bridgeheads. The Confederates, now that they start to see those 90,000 Federal soldiers starting to move across, that convinces Robert E. Lee that the battle will indeed be here at Fredericksburg. And that will set up the Battle of Fredericksburg that most people know that happened on December 13th. The December 11th fighting, it's very much overlooked. But in the roughly 6 hours of fighting that took place down in this area, there are about 660 casualties. About 330 of them will come from the 20th Massachusetts as well as Hall's Brigade. About 49 of them will come from the 50th New York Engineers. And then the Barksdale's men will lose about 240-ish men. That's in less than a day's fighting. To put that in perspective, the Second Battle of Fallujah, which took place over 6 weeks and saw intense U.S. urban combat, we sustained about that number of casualties in 6 weeks. So to show you the intensity of the fighting down here in just a matter of hours versus 6 weeks in modern warfare, it was really an intense battle, one-on-one, literally some men on one side of a house, on the other side of the house, taking one another out. It was a brutal place to be. And then that is going to lead into our December 12th and then, of course, our 13th action. So, on behalf of the American Battlefield Trust, I'm Kris White. I want to thank Chris Mackowski, Dan Davis, Sarah Bierle. We're going to bring you more coverage here of Fredericksburg for the 160th anniversary. We hope on YouTube you'll click that subscribe and bell notification. And over on Facebook, we hope that you'll like this video, share it with your friends and with your family. And we hope that you'll check out everything we have over at battlefields.org. We have membership options. We have free videos, lesson plans for teachers. We also have a field trip fund, all kinds of different things, all funded by the members of the American Battlefield Trust. So on behalf of the members of the Trust, I'm Kris White. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting battlefield preservation and education.
Chris Mackowski for the American Battlefield Trust, and I am at the Slaughter Pen Farm, and I want to say thanks to you for letting me be here, because it's your generosity and the generosity of our members that has allowed this to be preserved. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit, but it is the greatest example, a textbook example of how topography affects a battle, and we get to use this textbook thanks to you. And we're going to walk across this ground today and talk about that. In our last video, we were in Fredericksburg. We talked about that difficulty crossing the river on December 11th. Burnside then unsure what to do because he does not flush the Confederates out as he had hoped. And so he fritters away the 12th of December trying to figure out what his next step is going to be. He confers with all of his different commanders, and he's really going to spend all day on the 12th wasting the day trying to really come up with that plan. He eventually comes down here to the south end of the field where he confers with his Left Grand Division Commander William B. Franklin. And Franklin is in command of 65,000 men on this side of the battlefield. Burnside entrusts him with that large of a command because Franklin is experienced. The two of them know each other, have worked together well, and Burnside really feels like he's going to be able to pay attention to what's going on in the north end of the battlefield, and Franklin will have things well in hand down here. And as we'll find out, that's perhaps not going to be quite so true. That faith will be a little misplaced. When Burnside comes down here, he talks to Franklin, he talks to two of Franklin's corps commanders, John Reynolds and Baldy Smith, and they decide that what they're going to do is launch an attack across these fields against the right flank of the Confederate position. Simultaneously, there's going to be attack from the city itself against the left flank of the Confederate position. And Burnside decides that he wants to do both attacks at once so that they won't run into each other in the morning fog. He wants them well separated to avoid confusion. He also gets intelligence from a free black man who crosses the river and lets him know about a military road that stretches from the south to the north end of the Confederate line, and it connects those two lines. So Burnside later says that his objective is going to be to capture that military road, and in doing so, either allow his army to push up to the north or come down from the south, and the two wings will join, flushing Lee out of his position. Now, Lee has been wondering what Burnside was going to do. Initially, he wasn't sure that this was going to be Burnside's main action, but on the 12th, and as he sees the Army of the Potomac continue to cross the river, he decides, oh, this is going to be it. And so he's going to try to consolidate his army. Right now, he's only got James Longstreet on these heights behind me. They're anchoring their position at a place called Prospect Hill off to my right, and more famously to the north at a place called Telegraph Hill, and then Marye's Heights, and then up against the Rappahannock River. But he also has Stonewall Jackson's 2nd Corps stretched 25 miles to the south to cover other potential river crossings in case Burnside had shifted down there. Now that Lee's convinced this is where Burnside's going to cross, he consolidates that position. It's going to take Jackson all day on the 12th and overnight into the morning of the 13th to finally fill in here. That's going to allow Longstreet to contract his line. Longstreet's going to have the most geographically solid position on this entire Confederate position. And Jackson, because he's got a weaker topography to work with, is actually going to have more men per square foot along the line. So it's going to be a pretty strongly concentrated position. Now think about that, because if Burnside attacks here on the 12th and doesn't fritter away, he's going to be attacking the weakest section of the Confederate line with the fewest men per square foot on weak topography. Instead, he's going to end up attacking on the 13th against a position that's got more Confederates per square foot than anywhere else on this battlefield. When Burnside leaves Franklin, everyone thinks they know what the plan is going to be. The attack's supposed to start at dawn. Burnside says your written orders will be here before then. Hang tight and look for those orders. And they don't come. And they don't come. Midnight gets here, no orders. 1 o'clock gets here, no orders. Reynolds finally says, I'm going to go to sleep. I need some rest. John Reynolds asleep on a battlefield. Never see that before, right? So finally, dawn comes, still no orders. It's not till about 7:30 when James Hardee, a brigadier general on Burnside's staff, shows up with the orders. And it has taken Hardee an arduously long trip. Some say he even stopped for breakfast along the way, a charge that Hardee denies. But it's icy, the ground is hard for his horse, and when he finally gets here, he presents orders to Franklin, who is already worried that he's behind schedule. And he looks at the orders and is completely confounded. Now, I teach writing for a living. And so when I talk to my students, I say clarity, clarity, clarity. And I use Burnside's orders as the example of what not to do if you're trying to seek clarity. And they're really well worth looking at yourself. I'm not going to bore you with the whole thing today because they are a tangled, confused mess. But one thing he says is he tells Franklin to advance down the Bowling Green Road, using a division at least to secure the crossing at Captain Hamilton's, a Revolutionary War hero who had a house over there near the railroad crossing, and seize the heights. Now, Franklin, after all this, goes to heck in a handbasket. He'll parse words and say, well, he said seize instead of carry, and blah, 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 blah. But in fact, Franklin really just doesn't know what to make of these orders. Burnside also says make sure that your routes of retreat are well protected. So what Franklin does is he interprets this in the most conservative manner possible, rather than seek out any sort of clarification. I mean, he turns to Hardee, like, you send a brigadier general with your orders because a brigadier general has the authority to interpret for the commander. If he's just a courier, send a lieutenant, not a brigadier general. So when Franklin looks at Hardee for some sort of interpretation, Hardee's like, I don't know. And so does Hardee or Franklin go to the telegraph office, which is just a couple hundred yards away from Franklin's headquarters, and send word up to Burnside to ask for help? No, not at all. Does anybody send a courier back to ask for explanation? Nope, not at all. George Gordon Meade would later say that a great captain would throw caution to the wind and assume responsibility. But Franklin was not that man. Instead, what he's going to do with his 65,000 men is send a single division against that position, well protected, with a division on either side. And to talk about that arrangement, I'm going to ask my good friend Dan Davis to come out here and talk about how Franklin's going to send his forces across this field.
Thanks, Chris. Now, again, folks, William Buell Franklin is completely flummoxed by the orders that Burnside issues to him, and also based on the conversation that he had the prior night with Burnside at his headquarters. And I like to point out to folks that I think there's a time here on the morning of December the 13th that William Franklin kind of starts to give up a little bit on the idea of this being a successful attack. As Chris just mentioned, George Meade's comment about Franklin and his judgment here. Franklin, I think, is probably at this point in time, mid-morning of December the 13th, he's not thinking about success. He actually has in his mind failure. And if you plan for failure, you're going to fail, especially on the battlefield. Nevertheless, Franklin's going to shake out a few divisions to make the attack against Prospect Hill, off in the far distance behind me, and on the other side of the railroad tracks against Stonewall Jackson's position. George Gordon Meade's Pennsylvania reserves will fall into line over on my right. You can see here we're standing again on the Slaughter Pen Farm, the house here. You'll notice a driveway that goes out to a ridge, or a ridge we're going to be visiting here in just a few moments. And this road is actually a wartime road, is a wartime driveway used on the plantation here. George Meade's division is going to form on the opposite side of the road, stretching off to my right and to the south. John Gibbon's division is going to form on Meade's right, stretching all the way over, and his right flank will rest on the modern airport runway. About 9:30, 10 o'clock, Meade and Gibbon have formed. They're preparing for the attack when all of a sudden, about a mile off to the south, a single Confederate cannon is going to
fire. The shell is going to come arcing over the lines, and it's going to cause sheer panic and pandemonium amongst the Union troops here in this position. And to talk a little bit more about that episode, I'm going to bring on my colleague Sarah Bierle. Sarah?
Thanks, Dan. So as Dan mentioned, there is a cannon that fires on Union troops in this area. The area where, or the troops that actually get fired upon are a little more that direction. The cannon shot can't quite make it all the way up here. But it is a story that really happened, and it's something that is very startling to the Union troops out here on the line. In fact, when those first couple of shots happen, you have soldiers thinking, we've got a drunk gunner. We've got a drunk cannoneer on our own side. In some of their writings, they say we thought they had had too much commissary, a little too much to drink. But in fact, what has happened is there's a young artilleryman by the name of John Pelham. He's a major. He commands horse artillery, which is connected to Jeb Stuart's cavalry, and he has perfected tactics of taking guns into advanced positions, firing on the enemy, and then retiring. That is exactly what he's going to do in the early morning hours of December 13th, 1862, as this main part of the Battle of Fredericksburg happens. So it's foggy that morning. Pelham's going to advance about a mile from the Confederate line, take a position on the Union side, on the Union flank, and fire off those shots. Then he's going to stay in this advanced position, shifting his cannon, making it hard for Union gunners to find his exact position, and continue firing on the Union lines. Jeb Stuart will allow a second cannon to be sent out toward Pelham's advanced position. That's not going to turn out so well for that second cannon. The Union gunners will get range on it and send it out of action. Pelham will hold his position until he is out of ammunition, much to Jeb Stuart's panic. He continues to send messages telling Pelham to withdraw as cannon fire from multiple Union batteries are trying to target his area. And at one point, Stuart sends a message, "Get back from destruction, you gallant fool, John Pelham." Pelham's action is witnessed by a lot of the Confederate commanders along the line, including Robert E. Lee, who's watching from the area that we now call Lee's Hill. Lee is impressed with the gallantry, with the courage that he sees Pelham display. But he is a little disappointed. He didn't want those opening shots of the battle to be happening that early. So Lee does provide some criticism, if you will, to Jeb Stuart for allowing that, even while he praises Pelham and calls him gallant, the nickname that will follow Pelham for the rest of his life and into historical memory.
Now, this becomes problematic for the Union advance because as they begin to start across this field, which they'll start advancing around noon, it's going to divert Doubleday's entire division. Now, instead of being off inventing baseball, he's got to being off not inventing baseball, he's got to be paying attention to this lone gun crew. Now, before the advance begins, the artillerists of the Union Army are going to line up along the Richmond Road, and they're going to soften up the Confederate position. There's going to be about an hour-long bombardment before the Federals advance. Confederates are not allowed to return fire. Stonewall Jackson wants them to keep their positions hidden. So they're going to stay back there in what is an earth-shattering, nerve-wracking, hour-long bombardment before they're allowed to return fire. And so finally the Federals will begin their advance across this field. John Gibbon off to my left, George Gordon Meade off to my right, Doubleday beyond that. But because Doubleday is the extreme left flank of the Union Army, he's going to be uber cautious. And he's going to divert his advance to try to deal with Pelham because he doesn't know exactly what Pelham is. There'll be some infantry fighting down there as well before Pelham finally gets driven off. That's going to become important because, as we'll see, there's going to be some Union success here. And if Doubleday was in position, he would be exactly where George Gordon Meade would need him to be to monopolize on that success. But instead, Doubleday is diverted. So at about noon, the Federals begin advancing across this field. And as we move across this field, look at the terrain around us. Most people come out here and they say, gosh, it's just open and flat. And indeed it is. But it's deceptive as well because there are features out here on this field that we can't see unless we begin to advance ourselves. Temperatures are going to be in the mid-50s by the afternoon of the 13th. So that's going to turn these fields to mud because there had been snow a few days earlier. It had been planted in corn that had been harvested, so there are going to be corn stalks out here. I want you to think about all those hard little corn stalks. So when the Federals have to dive for cover, it'll be like jumping on punji sticks, which is just absolutely miserable and uncomfortable. But they come to one of these features that we see right here that we couldn't see from the road. This is what's known as a Virginia ditch fence. It was used for irrigation, for keeping your cattle on one side of the field or the other. And it's got shallow, it's got water in it at the time. So we've got about 3 feet of standing cold water in this ditch fence. And if we look, we can see that it does not stretch across this field in a straight line. It's curvy. So as the Federals advance across this field, the front ranks hit this ditch fence, which they couldn't see, and they literally fall into it and stumble through it. So they're wet, they're muddy, their ranks are in disarray. They've got to stop and get themselves back into line. So again, one reason why we want to preserve these battlefields is so we can see features like this and understand why battles unfold the way they do. It's a complete surprise to these Federals who have to get through, redress their ranks, and continue onward. In the meantime, we've got Federal artillery booming over their heads. Imagine how nerve-wracking that is for these guys. Really curious, though, that the Confederates are not yet returning fire. Dan, what's it like to be out here on that day in this advance as you're continuing forward to that Confederate position?
I cannot imagine the intensity that was going through the Union ranks. Again, as they're moving forward, they are having to essentially not only navigate these ditch fences that are out here in the field, but they're also waiting for that inevitable moment when the Confederates are going to open fire. But if you recall, Stonewall Jackson, he's an old artillerist. This isn't his first rodeo, and he's going to wait for the Federals to get roughly about halfway out into this field, which is just a little bit farther from where I'm standing, and then he's going to order his guns to open up. Reuben Walker's guns up on Prospect Hill off to my right. Greenlee Davidson's guns, John Brockenbrough's guns off my left shoulder and in the distance are going to finally open fire. Again, as Kris mentioned, bringing Meade and Gibbon to a halt. The Union guns will run out into the field and return fire, hitting Prospect Hill to the point where Prospect Hill is the Confederate artillerists up there are going to take so many casualties, it will become known as Dead Horse Hill. After that Union bombardment has softened up the Confederate position, Meade and Gibbon are going to lurch forward once again. And speaking of lurching forward, let's lurch forward ourselves and continue walking out to this plateau where Jackson waited for the Federals to reach before he ordered his gunners to open fire. Now again, George Meade is advancing off to my left, John Gibbon off to my right. George Meade's men are going to begin taking fire despite the casualties that were inflicted by the Union bombardment. They're going to start taking fire down from Prospect Hill. And so Meade's division is actually going to divert into a low, marshy area. It's a gap that Jackson has left open in his line. It's a very low swamp. It's even swampy today, 160 years later, if you ever have an opportunity to explore it. And Meade's men are going to move into that gap, into that low morass, that swampy area, to take cover. Now, why Jackson has left this area open? He believes that, well, it's swampy, it's a low area. The Federals would never try to come through that portion of his line during their attack, but yet they do. Meade's men are going to get up on top of Prospect Hill and begin flanking the Confederate infantry, a brigade under James Archer, out of their position. Meade has a toehold on the Confederate position atop Prospect Hill, but his men are running low on ammunition and he needs supports. He needs additional infantry, the infantry that Kris had mentioned would have been from Abner Doubleday's division, yet Doubleday is, unfortunately, because of Pelham's bombardment, is not in a position to support Meade at that time. Kris?
And it's really important because the reason Doubleday is diverted, and he should have been in position down here, following the orders that Burnside laid out, the road would have taken him into position. What nobody knows at the time, this is something that historian Frank O'Reilly discovered years later, is that Franklin and Burnside are working from different maps. And so Burnside's map shows the road going exactly to the Confederate right flank. Franklin's map does not show that. And so that's one of the reasons why he's so confused about how to deploy his men. So here's an opportunity where if they had known about this miscommunication, they might have been able to fix things up, and Doubleday might have been where he needed to be. But now we're going to have what I'd like to think of as a tale of two division commanders. We're going to have David Bell Birney on the Union side, and we're going to have Jubal Early on the Confederate side. And both of these men had the opportunity to show independent thinking, to demonstrate being able to think quick under fire, and they're going to react in two extremely different ways. It's a desperate moment for Meade. He's up, his men are in the Confederate lines, they've had success, but his brigadiers are getting shot down, he's losing commanders, he's losing men, and he can't find his own corps commander, John Reynolds. John Reynolds should be highly visible on this battlefield, directing reinforcements where they need to go. But Meade can't find Reynolds. Reynolds has effectively demoted himself. Kris White, who's behind the camera, loves to make this point. Reynolds is a major general, and he's acting like a major. He is meddling with every single artillery unit along the road and those that come out into the field, telling them where to aim and how to adjust and what to do here and there. If you read the accounts in the ORs, you can see reports from all of these different units saying, oh yeah, John Reynolds came and he told us to turn our cannon 2 degrees this way, blah, 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 blah. Can I have fries with that? And it was just like so super annoying. But it's terrible, it's cataclysmic, because Reynolds should be directing the battle. And Meade desperately needs help at this moment. He has no Doubleday. He has no help out here from Reynolds. So he turns to David Bell Birney, who's a division commander in Baldy Smith's 3rd Corps. And he says, my men are dying up there. You got to send some reinforcements to me. And Birney, who is the great model of Puritan officiousness, says, well, I'd be happy to help. Just send word up through your corps commander, who can send word to my corps commander, who'll send word down to me, and I'll be glad to come. And Meade, as you know, very calm, cool, collected demeanor. He explodes so badly that one staff officer says he makes the stones creep. And he says to Birney, you will send your men in to the aid of mine. I outrank you. I will take responsibility. You will do it. But by the time Birney finally mobilizes and gets onto the field, it's going to be too little, too late. We'll talk about that in just a moment. On the flip side, we have another division commander who has the opportunity to exercise independent judgment, march to the sound of the guns, Jubal Early. And I'm not going to get too much into this because Sarah K. Bierle is going to come back in just a second. But I want to contrast Early with Birney in this moment. Early has been ordered by his commander, Stonewall Jackson, to deploy off to the right, following a road that would take them out into the direction of Stuart's cavalry. But he hears the sounds of the guns, and refugees from this attack, Archer's brigade, are flying up over the hill saying, we need help, we need help. So should Early march to the sound of the guns, or should he follow his orders from Stonewall Jackson? And this is no easy decision, because let's remember, by this point in the war, Jackson has arrested some 28 subordinates for various infractions and for not following the letter of the law. Most dramatic example would be Dick Garnett, but let's not forget A.P. Hill is under court-martial at the moment. Those things are just simmering. So Early himself, on the march to Fredericksburg from the Shenandoah Valley, was nearly arrested because his men were drunk and hanging off cannons like they were 4 years old on a battlefield. So it's no small thing for Early. Do I follow orders or not and get arrested? And he marches to the sound of the guns. He exhibits the exact kind of independent thinking in a crisis that Lee really looks for. He reacts completely different than Birney, who could also march to the sound of the guns. Birney decides to be officious. Early decides to be effective. To talk a little bit more about those Confederate counterattacks, as a big lime tractor comes up behind us, we're going to swing positions, and I'm going to ask Sarah K. Bierle to talk a little bit more about that Confederate response.
Thanks, Kris. All right, looks like we're good with the truck. That's one of the great things about battlefield preservation is we get this as a classroom where we can come out and really explore the land like we're doing today, but we can also have agricultural opportunities for our local farmers. So as Kris was saying, the Confederates have choices here, and Jubal Early is going to be making those decisions that are going to impact the battle. So the Confederate gap in the line that Meade is able to exploit is actually between Archer's brigade, Lane's brigade, and they're going to start moving reinforcements into the area. And the brigade that I'd like to talk about for a couple minutes is known as Lawton's brigade, but it's not commanded by Lawton here at the battle. It is in Early's division, and it's going to be commanded by Colonel Atkinson at the time of on December 13th, 1862. So they are going to be moving in and launching a counterattack against Meade's forces that are broken in and are starting to push at Jackson's line to exploit that breakthrough. And the Lawton's brigade is the 31st Georgia, the 38th Georgia, the 60th Georgia, the 61st Georgia, and the 13th Georgia. Now the first 4 regiments that I talked about, the 31st, 38th, 60th, and 61st Georgia, are going to be ones that make the big charge that we're going to focus on here. The 13th Georgia, their colonel was a little hesitant, and they only make it to the railroad tracks, which those are located behind me. Probably can't see them, but if we get lucky, maybe we'll have a train come through. So Atkinson's brigade is going to charge in and start pushing the Federal troops back. They're going to get them on the run, and then they will continue into the fields where we are standing now. And I like to share some descriptions in the words of the soldiers themselves. So I found a brief account by a soldier who makes this charge. He later wrote a memoir. It's Private G.W. Nichols. He says, "Our brigade had never been driven from any position, and the Yankees stood firm." This is back at the breakthrough site. "After exchanging 1 or 2 volleys, we charged them with a terrible yell and drove them back toward the river without much trouble. We drove the ones that were in our front back toward the old turnpike road. Our part of the line had done its duty well and heroically. We had the ground strewn with dead and wounded Yankees. Here we also lost some of our brave, noble boys. The Union line was much longer than ours, and so the enemy at our right began to swing around us and advance, which caused considerable confusion in our ranks. They were so close to us that they began to order us to halt and throw down our guns and surrender. We were ordered to retreat, which we had to do under galling fire, and our losses were much greater on the retreat from the fire of the flanking column than the ones we had been driving." So the last part of his description there is happening out in this field, probably in areas that we're looking at, maybe near where we're standing, because Atkinson's brigade is going to charge out into the slaughter pen field. They're going to go a little too far, and they don't have support with them. The Union infantry lines are longer. They're going to start flanking them, eventually sending Atkinson's brigade back toward the Confederate lines. And as we look toward the ending of the fighting here at Slaughter Pen Farm, and I know we'll have some other things we'll be sharing about it, but think about how the cold is going to come in again as darkness settles. And you have wounded in blue and gray out here on the field. And later in his writing, Nichols and others who participate in this fight, they start to worry after the fury of the battle has ended. They start to worry about their wounded comrades and even the wounded enemy who are left out on this field. And they're concerned that they might actually freeze to death as darkness falls.
Yeah, Sarah, I think the, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. I think the human interest part of things are sometimes overlooked out here when we start talking about divisions moving here and brigades moving there and this, that, and the other thing. But before I jump into a couple human interest stories for you, let's just get you quickly oriented to where we are. So you're on the Slaughter Pen Farm. It's about 212 acres, including a very small slice of what the National Park Service owns. 208 acres are owned by us at the American Battlefield Trust. This is the largest open attack plain that is still in one piece here on the south side of Fredericksburg. And that's the reason we preserved this for about $12.3 million, because this gives you the idea of what it looked like. And this ground largely is untouched since the time it was in 1862. This was part of one of the plantations down here. We had a number of plantations running through the Rappahannock River Valley. We had Arthur Bernard and Alfred Bernard's. They owned the Bend. They also owned Mansfield. Mansfield was burned by North Carolinians in April of 1863 while they're trying to make breakfast. But Smithfield, Thomas Lee Pratt's property, that house is still there. That is a Fredericksburg Country Club. So if you look down in this area, we would have had more than 3,000 acres of plantation land. Not all of it will be cultivated. When we looked at the census records, it'll talk about improved versus unimproved land, but there are a large number of open farms on the south side of Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg in 1862 was about 2 miles to the north of us, maybe 3 as a crow flies. Still sits up there today. In 1862, it had a population of about 5,040 people, almost half and half between white and black. Some free, some enslaved there. Then we also have over inside of this tree line, the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. That is a rail line that runs through here. It goes exactly what its name implies. It comes from Richmond, 55 miles to the south of us, goes to Fredericksburg, and then terminates 15 miles north of us at Aquia Creek. We have 2 major roads running through here. One is the Telegraph Road. We'll visit that later today. And then we have Route 2 and 17 today. That's the other major road. It's also known as the Richmond Highway, the Bowling Green Road, the Road to Richmond, all kinds of different names. And the reason that Burnside comes here is to seize the railroad, use that to supply his army, and then use the parallel roads of the Telegraph and the Bowling Green Road to head down towards the Confederate capital of Richmond. Well, the Confederates have stopped him in his tracks, and now we have a battle here at Fredericksburg. Neither commander initially decided they wanted to fight here at Fredericksburg. The fight kind of just grew from the 2 armies making contact here. So if you haven't checked out our other video that we did this morning, we talked about the street fighting that took place on December the 11th. This is our December 13th fighting. Prospect Hill is about a mile to the south of us. Inside of that tree line is Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. The Lee Drive area is out in front of us, and then that'll run up into the Lansdowne Valley and eventually up to the 5 hills that consist of Marye's Heights. Now, out in this field, we're going to see heroism, and Dan Davis is going to talk about here in a few minutes. One of the reasons we preserve this land is 5 Medal of Honor recipients earned their medals on this land. But we also have some other stories that took place out here. Are you going to tell the story of von Valkenburg? All right. So we have a Confederate story out here of James von Valkenburg. He comes out into this field as part of the 61st Georgia. They'll come charging down into this field. Sarah was just talking about those Georgians coming down here of the Douglas, Lawton, Gordon Brigade. They came down into this area, and von Valkenburg will be down inside of what was probably a ditch fence. And he's going to get down there with a Yankee, and he's going to tell the Yankee, "You're my prisoner." And the Yankee says, "Nah, you're my prisoner." Well, they're actually caught between the lines. And they decide, a gentleman's agreement, that whoever takes this field back, that person will then become that person's prisoner. Well, the Federals counterattack through here, and von Valkenburg is captured. Fast forward until 1864. Von Valkenburg has been exchanged. He's now fighting in the Confederate Army again, about 18 miles to the west of us, out in the wilderness. There he encounters the 7th Pennsylvania Reserves, the same unit that captured him here at Fredericksburg. Von Valkenburg, with about 20 men, in the confusion that was the wilderness, arrives and captures more than 250 Pennsylvanians because he put on a big bluff, and then the Pennsylvanians, who were only a few weeks left in the war, decided that they were going to, that discretion was a better part of valor, and they surrendered to von Valkenburg. So he is going to kind of give that, return the favor, as it were. And it wouldn't be a live video with us without a massive piece of machinery going whenever I speak. Usually it's a lawnmower. Today it's been a jackhammer at stop 1, and today it's a lime thrower going right now.
And a helicopter.
And a helicopter doing touch and goes. To the south of us is Prospect Hill. And we are going to be around Christmas time. And on Prospect Hill will go the Pennsylvania Reserves of George Gordon Meade. The highest ranking officer to go on top of Prospect Hill is a guy named Samuel McCartney Jackson. No relation to Samuel L. Jackson, but he is related to another future general as well as a Hollywood actor. Samuel McCartney Jackson was captured during the 7 Days Battles. He was taken to Libby Prison, where he was actually imprisoned with John Reynolds, George McCall, and some others. He then is exchanged, goes on to fight here at Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, survives the war, goes home, and his maternal grandson is an actor named Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart, who was the star of It's a Wonderful Life, his grandfather was the highest ranking officer for the Federals to arrive on Prospect Hill. McCartney Jackson gets there, but he can't stay there. So most people, whenever they come down here, have no idea that there's a tie to Christmas as well as to the future World War II hero, Jimmy Stewart, who was also a B-24 pilot, squadron commander, wing commander at one point, and goes on to become a general in the United States Army Air Force. Over behind me is a gentleman. Sarah, I'm going to grab my folder from you. Is a gentleman serving with the 136th Pennsylvania Infantry. His name is George Heiser. Heiser's in a 9-month regiment, and Heiser, this is what you get when you're doing stuff live. Heiser is going to see one of his friends wounded as they cross the railroad tracks. And as Heiser goes across the railroad tracks, he refuses to leave his friend. Heiser decided that he was going to stick it out with his buddy. Didn't want to leave him behind. And he, Heiser, and his friend were both captured and sent on to Libby prison. They're exchanged, and after the 9-month enlistment ends, he goes back to his home in Cambria County, Pennsylvania, which is Johnstown, Pennsylvania. If you're fans of the movie Slapshot, you'll probably know Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Heiser opens a general store there. He's the guy that everybody loves because if you couldn't pay, he would tell you, pay me next week, or, you know, just put a few dollars down. And on Memorial Day of 1889, he proudly marched in the parade there in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. But sadly, the next day, he and his wife, as well as his store, will be swept away in the Johnstown flood. He survived the hell was Fredericksburg, as well as Libby Prison, only to die in his own home. This is a picture of a Pennsylvania Railroad car that drove through one of the houses in Johnstown with a tree sticking out of it. You could see a gentleman sitting on top of it. George's son, Victor, will actually survive the flood. And this is Victor here. Victor, just like his dad, was a guy that everybody liked. Victor went on to become a doctor. And just like his father, if you couldn't pay, he wouldn't charge you. Victor, after the floodwaters receded during the Johnstown flood, went out to where the house and the store once stood. All he found sitting there was a wardrobe, basically a chest. He opens up the chest, and what does he find in there? He finds his father's Civil War uniform. He reaches into his pocket and he pulls out his entire inheritance, 1 penny, which was possibly carried here at Fredericksburg as well as into Libby Prison. But Heiser is just one of the many stories that took place here out at the Slaughter Pen Farm, both north and the south. John Gibbon fought against his brothers. It was literally brother against brother. We have Georgians and North Carolinians standing up on top of the rail line, pouring shots down into this area. We have other men going and risking their lives to tear down a building in the middle of this area now known as the Chimneys so that Union sharpshooters couldn't use that. It was really a lot of human interest stories just in these 200 and some odd acres. And that's just some of the stories out here of the more than 200,000 combatants at the Battle of Fredericksburg.
Poor Kris's voice is giving way on him because he's doing stalwart work for us out here. I'm going to have Dan Davis come in and talk about the Medal of Honors in just a second, since we've been talking about human interest. We've talked about George Gordon Meade sweeping through the swamp over there, pushing up onto Prospect Hill, driving Archer's brigade off their heights, and then the Union position collapsing there. We haven't talked much about John Gibbon over here. He starts moving shortly after Meade began his advance. Meade's men were pinned down out here for about 45 minutes in that artillery duel we talked about. And then one of these Union artillery pieces hits a Confederate caisson, sending it up. And that gets Meade's men to their feet, and that's what rushes them forward. Gibbon's like, oh wait, hey gosh, they're going, we gotta go with them. But he gets his men up. It's his first time leading his division into battle, so he's gonna dress his ranks rather than spontaneously rush forward, and he's finally gonna push his men ahead toward the Confederate position off in that direction. One of the things I love about this field is there's a big tall tree over there. That's the direction that Gibbon's men converge on. Gibbon, a North Carolinian, as Kris mentioned, is gonna end up fighting against James Lane's North Carolinians, who are posted in that direction. And in Lane's brigade are 3 of Gibbon's brothers. They don't know it yet, but they'll find out later. Lane's got 5 regiments up there. Leading the charge against them is Nelson Taylor. He's got 4 regiments, and the fight gets so intense that 2 of Taylor's regiments collapse behind them. But coming up behind them is Peter Lyle. He's got 6 regiments that are going to stick with the 2 of Taylor's remaining, and they're going to make it across that railroad, the railroad tracks and up into the Confederate line. Over here, when Meade's guys got in, they actually broke the line and got in behind them. Here, Lane's men will bend back, but they won't break. And so the fighting's going to get pretty intense. Adrian Root's brigade is then going to come up and join that fight. And so as this fighting's going, this is when those Confederate counterattacks start coming in. Sarah talked about Atkinson's men coming out into this position. There's going to be a whole big dance of brigades back in there as Confederates push and shove to get into position and fill that gap and come to reinforcements and drive Gibbon's men across this field, back across this open plain. That's when David Bell Birney finally gets his men into position, and he's able to come out here and prevent that retreat from turning into a complete and utter rout. A little too little, a little too late. In the midst of all that, we have some incredible examples of heroism that make this particularly hallowed ground. And I'm going to ask Dan to come in and talk about those medals of honor.
Thanks, Kris, and to Kris, and thank you, everyone. Now, as Gibbon's men move forward from the Richmond Bowling Green stage road, they relieve the 13th Massachusetts Infantry, which was deployed out here on the plateau we're standing on as skirmishers. As the 13th Massachusetts makes their way back toward the rear, a fellow named George Maynard is going to notice that his best friend, Charlie Armstrong, is nowhere to be found. So Maynard makes a conscious decision. He's going to come from the Union rear all the way out here under fire while Gibbon's division is squaring off against Lane's North Carolinians, and he's going to find that his best friend Charlie has been out here on the skirmish line. He's been incapacitated, he's wounded, and he cannot move. So Maynard is going to pick up Armstrong, put him over his shoulders, carry him back to a Union hospital. But sadly, Charlie's going to succumb to those wounds, but for his actions, George Maynard will later receive a Medal of Honor. Now, as Gibbon attempts to push his attack through against Lane's North Carolinians, the North Carolinians are going to target not only the officers, but the color bearers of the individual Union regiments. One of the color bearers who's going to fall is from the 136th Pennsylvania Infantry. A fellow named Philip Petty is going to pick up the flag, and he's going to carry it forward, and the line is slowly going to lurch ahead following the colors. Almost at the same moment in the 26th New York, the color bearer is going to be shot down. And then a fellow named Martin Schubert, a German immigrant, is going to pick up the flag. Martin Schubert did not need to be on the field that morning because in his pocket is a medical discharge that he had received the day before. But he knew his men were going into battle, and he wanted to be with them for the coming fight. Schubert's going to carry the flag of the 26th New York forward, and he's going to be shot down. At the same time, another immigrant, this one from Great Britain, a fellow named Joseph Keene, is going to pick up the flag, take the flag from Schubert, and carry the flag forward, helping to drive Gibbon's overall attack home. And for their actions, Petty, Schubert, and Keene will all receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. At the same time, during those Confederate counterattacks, moving off of Prospect Hill, threatening Meade's division, threatening Birney's division, a fellow named Charles Collis, he's a colonel in the 114th Pennsylvania Infantry. He's going to see his color bearer shot down, and he's launching a counterattack of his own to try to push back Early's division. Collis is going to carry the flag forward. It's going to be captured in a very famous painting that you can still see today. And for his actions, Charles Collis will also receive the Medal of Honor. So we have examples of valor here on this field. 5 Medals of Honor were awarded for valor and for heroism under fire here to Union soldiers at the Slaughter Pen Farm during the Battle of Fredericksburg. Kris?
One of my favorite little episodes about Collis's Zouaves out here. Collis had been embarrassed at the Battle of Kernstown in March of '62. And so when he rallies his troops here and he grabs the flag and he says, "Remember Kernstown!" to try to rally them. And the men that he's commanding at that time weren't at Kernstown with him. So they sort of look at him like, huh? Well, okay. So when the Union attacks finally fall back, the Confederates then settle into their position. And finally, Ambrose Burnside will check in on events down here at the south end of the field. And Franklin will have called off the attacks. He will not continue. He's concerned about keeping his routes of retreat secure and open. Now, this will flummox Burnside because he will later say, "I didn't give Franklin command of half the army for him to conduct a reconnaissance in force. He trusted Franklin's experience and ability to lead this attack, but Franklin calls it off, and he doesn't tell Burnside. So when Burnside finally finds out, he's throwing men against the stone wall at the base of Marye's Heights, and we'll be going up there in a little later. Burnside's continuing those attacks, thinking that they're supporting this attack down here. They're still trying to break through. And so when we think about the futility of what goes on at the northern end of the field, remember that part of it is because Burnside thinks he's supporting an attack down here, but that attack is no longer happening. He will order Franklin to resume the attack. Baldy Smith's Third Corps has essentially been unengaged. They'll be like, but essentially won't lead to much. And then as a result, Franklin will call off the day's attack, not doing anything. And again, not tell Burnside. So that's going to be a key part that's going to tie into our overall story here as we continue our coverage throughout the day. So we've got a fantastic piece of ground to explore here. We hope that you make it out here to check things out for yourself. I'm going to ask Kris White to come back on one last time to wrap things up for us.
Yeah, we are dual streaming for the first time, so if you're wondering why we were blipping a little bit, we're using a lot of bandwidth while we're out here. So we're on YouTube as well as Facebook. So I wanted to answer some questions. We're doing a lot of different things while we're out here. So Darren Rollins says Kris Mackowski's passion is infectious.
Woohoo! Catch that one, baby!
Yeah, his decibel level's also through the roof. So if you're wondering, buried in the red. People were asking what this place looked like in 1862. Well, this was largely barren fields because this had been harvested, so it would have been muddy, very muddy. Underneath the, to go back to talk about the weather for a moment, during the day it's about 56 degrees during the Battle of Fredericksburg, but at night it's about 24 degrees. So there was rains and snows the week prior to the battle. That is going to put about 3 to 4 inches of mud on top of here, and then below that mud is actually a lot of ice. So you would not have seen crops out here. We're a little too far north for tobacco, so what they would have grown on these plantations, you would have seen corn, wheat, potatoes, things like that. Lots of animals. You would have seen those. Out here, we have some folks watching from the UK, the Netherlands, North Carolina. We have a bunch of North Carolinians off in that direction. Someone talking about the Hatfield and McCoys, not in this state at least, but we have all kinds going on, all kinds of things going on here. And if you did have problems with your connectivity, these videos will upload here as soon as we stop going live, as soon as we end this feed, and it'll all buffer out for you. So you can go back and take a look at these. And do check out our 2 videos that we shot earlier. Yesterday we had a video up kind of setting up the campaign, and then earlier this morning we were talking about the street fighting at Fredericksburg. Those are available both on our YouTube channel, so check out American Battlefield Trust YouTube channel, click the subscribe button and click that bell notification. And over on Facebook, please click that like button and subscribe to us over there as well. And on behalf of the American Battlefield Trust, I'm going to wrap this one up. We're going to go live later on this afternoon. Excuse me, we're going to take you to one of the most famous parts of the battlefield, up to Marye's Heights. We might do another live later on today. We'll see what we're doing. And see how everything's going out here. It's a little cold, but not as cold as it was for 155th Fredericksburg when we were out here. And it was negative with the wind chill and freezing. So you can go back and watch that fun live feed that we did back then. So on behalf of the American Battlefield Trust, I'm Kris White. Thanks to Kris Mackowski, Dan Davis, Sarah Bierle. Thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting battlefield preservation and education.
Kris Mackowski for the American Battlefield Trust. I'm up top Marye's Heights at the Fredericksburg battlefield, and we have live coverage today to commemorate the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Fredericksburg, which took place on December 13th, 1862. Joining me behind the camera is my hetero life mate, Kris White. Off to my side is my great pal, Dan Davis, and of course, my partner in crime, Sarah K. Bierle as well. They'll be coming on to share parts of this story. If you've been with us today, we've been down looking at the street fighting along the Rappahannock and Hawk Street and all the really crazy things that Ambrose Burnside had to do to rewrite the rules of war as he tried to get across the Rappahannock on December 11th. Then we went down to the Slaughter Pen Farm, one of the greatest preservation achievements in the entire history of the modern preservation movement. And there, Ambrose Burnside intended to send an entire column against the Confederate right flank to capture a military military road that connected that end of the Confederate line with this end of the Confederate line here on the northern position. From here, the Confederate line would extend another mile or so to anchor on the Rappahannock, and it's about 5.5 or 6 miles down to the very end of Prospect Hill. Robert E. Lee had been occupying this area since the middle of November when he slid into this position to intercept Burnside's attempts to get across the river. But of course, as we know, Burnside couldn't get across the river because he didn't have pontoon boats. And by the time they arrived, he'd lost his element of surprise, and Lee had been able to fortify this position and block the way. So of course, we talked earlier about the street fighting and the attempt to get the army over here. We talked about the movements down at the Slaughter Pen Farm to attack Lee's position. Here, what Burnside tries to do is also hit this part of the line in an attempt to grab that military road and roll downward. You can see behind me the beautiful panorama, the city of Fredericksburg behind me. Hard to envision today, but once upon a time that it was 900 yards of open space down to the edge of town. So there was a wide open killing field that was created. Dan Davis is going to come talk about that in just a few minutes. There was a fairground out there. There were a few houses dotting the landscape, but in essence, Federals are going to have to advance uphill, upslope across some slippery ground. There had been snow earlier in the week, but by the 13th, temperatures rise into the 50s, and it turns that snow into a sea of mud that the Federals are going to have to cross over there. Today, you can see the steeples in the background of some of the churches that are downtown. You can see the checkered boxes of the Purina Dog Tower down there as well. Not a historical artifact, by the way. And as we think about what things were like for the Confederates perched atop these heights, Edward Porter Alexander, the First Corps Chief of Artillery, is here with the Washington Artillery with between 40 and 45 guns. And he says that when he finally has the chance to open on that field, it will be as if they're able to go over it with a fine-tooth comb. A chicken could not live on that ground when they open on it, and the Federals are going to discover that the hard way. Burnside is supposed to launch his two attacks simultaneously at both ends of the field shortly after daybreak on the 13th. But a delay in getting orders to either end of the field means that the fog that's going to provide cover begins to evaporate. Sunlight comes out. Confederates can see the Federals that are massing. Burnside's waiting for the attack at the south end of the field to start, and it doesn't. And so he's eventually going to get things moving up here shortly after 10 o'clock. To set the table for us, I'm going to ask Dan Davis to come on and talk a little bit about what things were like for those Federals.
Thanks, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. If you watched our videos, and please go back on Facebook or YouTube, watch our videos. We're here live for the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Fredericksburg. You will see and notice the open plain, the beautiful open plain that you, the members of the American Battlefield Trust, helped us preserve of the Slaughter Pen Farm. You get a good sense of what the Union attacks were like, or you could at least envision them there. A straight-on attack against the Confederate position. But here, on the Marye's Heights front, coming out of the city of Fredericksburg, it's a much different story. There's a couple of factors that are going to play into creating what was once an open plain behind me, stretching back toward the Civil War era town of Fredericksburg, into both a natural and an artificial killing field. The town itself will act as a funnel to funnel troops out of the city as they make their attacks here against the Confederate position on Marye's Heights. Off to my left, off to the south, there's Hazel Run. Hazel Run is going to be a natural barrier, further pinching those Union troops in. Off to the north, there's a Slackwater, again, navigation canal. There's a canal toward the northern end of the city, also serving to pinch those Federal troops into essentially a bowl as they make their attacks out of the town. As they come out of the town, they're going to have to navigate a 15-foot wide, 5-foot deep canal ditch, which is now modern Kenmore Avenue, if you're familiar with Fredericksburg or if you've ever visited Fredericksburg. So the Federals are going to be essentially just funneled in to the open plain, and they are literally, as Chris mentioned, they're sitting ducks as they come across that open field. Now, as they begin to come out of the city, the Confederate gunners up here, the Washington Artillery, well, they've had several weeks to occupy and prepare this position. They know exactly when to open fire with their artillery because they've gone out and they paced off the distance between the stone wall, the canal ditch, and the edge of the city. And as Union troops continue to funnel out of the town late in the morning, early into the afternoon. As the attacks here pick up, the Confederate artillery will open upon them as they're moving out of the town, as they're getting over that canal ditch. Now, while the artillery is bombarding those Union columns and the Union lines of attack, the Confederate infantry, who my friend Sarah Bierle is going to come on and talk about in just a few moments, they're going to remain silent, crouched behind the stone wall beneath me, and they're going to hold their fire. Now, the Federal troops, as they come out of that canal ditch, again, under artillery fire, they're going to make their way uphill toward the high ground. They're going to cross through a swale, which you can still see in some areas today. And when they get into that swale, or roughly where that swale is, that's when the artillery is going to fall silent, and that's the signal for the Confederate infantry below to open fire. That is the signal that the Union infantry is now within musket range, and the Confederates are going to stand up and pour a devastating fire into the Union lines. While the Confederates are now firing into the Union lines, the cannoneers up here on top of the heights, they're going to refocus their efforts on the next wave of Union soldiers coming out of the town. So this cycle goes takes place throughout the course of the day, from late in the morning roughly up until nightfall. The trade-off, if you will, between the artillery firing at the attacking Union soldiers and the Confederate infantry below me in the sunken row behind the stone wall firing at the Confederate soldiers. We always like to talk about, in fact, we were just talking about this a few moments ago, which Union soldier got the closest to the wall. A good argument could probably be made by men from the 5th New Hampshire Infantry or men from the 69th New York, the 88th New York Infantry from the Irish Brigade. But that's just a debate for another day, something that we probably will never know more about. But to tell us more about the Confederate infantry down in the sunken road, I'm going to bring on Sarah Bierle. Sarah?
I'm actually going to be Sarah's stunt double for a second, as we're going to walk and talk to get down to the road so Sarah actually can feel the crunch of the gravel under her feet as she talks about the Confederates who are jammed down there. There are going to be about 2,000 of them to start this battle, about 5,000 to end the battle, and those reinforcements are going to come from where we're at, down the face of this hill. Now, as we go, much prettier to look at than me is this panorama behind me. And it's hard to envision that open field because the neighborhood has encroached so close to the edge of the preserved battlefield. This was one of those places that the Union Army wasn't all that interested in saving and preserving. It's a humiliating loss. There are going to be about 13,000 Federal casualties here as a result of this battle, compared to only 5,000 Confederate casualties. So as in the post-war years, as veterans are talking about what they want to save, what they want to commemorate, and the government is helping provide funds to create these battlefields, Fredericksburg doesn't top that list because this was such a humiliation. And so as a result, the parts of this battlefield that do get preserved really are attached to the Confederate part of the story, because the Federals weren't really interested in the hometown folks. They're not interested in preserving the Federal story either. So they're going to preserve all this stuff with the Confederate position. As a result, our understanding of the story here is severely impacted over the course of 125 years, because this is the part of the battlefield most people are familiar with. I want to stop us here. It's one of my favorite spots in the whole park. As we look down, we can see the Innes House. That's a historical structure. There are bullet holes in the walls. We'll be able to take a look at that in just a second. We can see the sunken road and the stone wall. If you come here today, you get a chance to walk that sunken road, which was a modern road until 2003, when the city of Fredericksburg finally turned it over to the Park Service, and the Park Service restored it to its wartime appearance. So again, as we talk about what's been preserved and what's not been preserved, one reason that this part of the battle has gotten so much focus is because this is what had been preserved. So when they restored the road, they restored portions of the stone wall as well. They did a considerable amount of archaeological work. They found the old footing for the original wall. They matched it up with some photos. And so instead of maybe field stone that's just sort of stacked up in these small walls, we'll see when we get down there, it is a very formidable position of quarried stone from a quarry up near Aquia, same granite that's used to build a lot of the buildings that are up in Washington, D.C. And so they restored the wall, creating 2 new sections of really strong fortress-like position. There's a third section of the wall that was actually created in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps. We'll get down there in a second too. When the Park Service did finally get around to preserving some stuff here, the CCC came in and they rebuilt the part of the wall along what was still then a city street, so that at least people could see what it looked like to have a stone wall. You know, people show up at Fredericksburg, they've heard about the stone wall, where is it? So they created something. But that's fieldstone, and it's not nearly as impressive looking as that section of wall you can see behind me. There's also an original section of the wall further down, because the wall here is in 4 sections: the CCC section, the 2 that were done in the early 2000s, and then the original. And you can see how it was used as a retaining wall to keep dirt from spilling into the road. And the wall was on both sides of this road. So it becomes, as Dan mentioned earlier and Cheryl talked about in a second, you know, a natural fortified position in the same way that earthworks will be later on. And Confederates were able to pack that position and really give themselves a strong defense as the Federals come at them. As we look out there, we see a neighborhood today. The Park Service has been slowly purchasing some of the houses that are along the edge of the battlefield, so they've slowly been able to tear those down and extend the view just a little bit. But it's still really hard for us to imagine what it would have looked like to see across that plain 900 yards of open space. Let's take a walk.
And if you were keeping track, that was one full sentence that Mackowski kept talking through. And he likes to do it. He likes to talk about the Battle of Fredericksburg. This is Kris White, the voice of God behind the camera. I just want to point out a couple things. Kris was talking about the preservation efforts down here at Fredericksburg. This park was founded in February of 1927. The original congressional study that put it together claimed that they only needed initially 1,500 acres between the 4 battlefields down here: Chancellorsville, Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Fredericksburg, to commemorate these battlefields. They upped that number to about 2,500. And they're going to use what's called the Antietam plan, where they put in a road, and basically everything will always be battlefield. It'll always be preserved, and they will buy about 20 feet off this side, 20 feet off that side. But over time, these neighborhoods grew up. And the city of Fredericksburg, by the turn of the 20th century, was already growing up to the footsteps out here. So this is what you have whenever you fight on the edge of a city. One of the things I wanted to do was give a few shout outs. There's a guy watching named Gary Alderman. He has a Civil War page, I guess, and he says he wishes he was here with us all. He went to the wrong burg today.
Yeah, he thought it was Gettysburg.
Yeah, exactly. I see somebody from Finleyville, Pennsylvania. That's near my hometown. Tim York. Tim runs a super secret Facebook group, which is awesome. Nice to see you, Tim. Someone was asking about accessing Franklin's Crossing. Franklin's Crossing, let me put up on the battlefield sometimes. And this is Franklin's Crossing. Can you get down to it? No, it's private land right now. It's tucked in on the eastern shore that you're asking about, behind the Walmart and stuff, and it's pretty nasty to get down there. But you can take a boat and kind of see that area down there. I know that there are some preservation efforts going on down in that area for Franklin's Crossing. We had some folks watching from Delaware, Illinois. Anytime I see Delaware, all I can think of is Wayne's World. Then looks like Jeb Stewart Trammell, he watches a lot of our videos. He's out in Jackson, Mississippi watching, so it's great to see everybody who's out here and watching. Please share this with your friends and with your family, and we hope you're enjoying the content, and be sure to check out everything we have at battlefields.org.
So we're going to take a walk down into the stone, behind the stone wall and into the sunken road. And Sarah will talk a little bit about the Confederate position there as they get ready. When Burnside launches these attacks over the course of the day, he's going to start out with 4,000 guys. They're going to come up. They're going to hit that strong Confederate defense. They're going to melt away. And so then the next wave is going to come up. And the idea at first is that with, you know, the first division that goes up with those 4,000 guys attacking in 3 brigades, the idea is that they're supposed to get uphill super fast. And the Confederates are going to have skirmishers out in that open field that are going to act as human shields to protect the Federal advance. Confederates behind the stone wall, in theory, won't shoot at their own men, so those human shields will protect the Federal advance. And if they get up there fast enough, they can jump up over the wall and start stabbing and shooting. And if we think about what happened at Antietam, where the Confederates also used a sunken road as a fortified rifle pit, and they held off wave after wave of Federal attacks, but once the Federals broke through, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. And the idea is very similar here, that if the Federals can break through, it'll be like shooting fish in a barrel. But that first brigade, as it comes up, and it is stopped, and the second one kind of tries to wash up past it in the way waves come up on a shore, one higher than the other. Second brigade is rejected. Third brigade is rejected. So that first division attack is stopped. That's under French. So then Hancock is going to be asked to send his guys. He's going to have 4,500 men, including the Irish Brigade, and one of the most famous units to fight here, as Dan talked about just a few minutes ago. And they're going to come up, and they are also going to come to grief. Those Irishmen, they're a very famous charge, and you know, they're going to get really close, but not close enough. Of the 1,500 guys in the Irish Brigade, only about 150 of them are going to be able to rally around the flag by the end of the day. They take such heavy losses. Now, of course, the survivors will eventually regain their position and get together and recoalesce, so it's not totally wiping them out. But after Antietam and after this, these are kind of the main hurrahs of the Irish Brigade overall, and they're pretty diminished by the time they get to, for instance, Gettysburg. Kris is going to mention something here from the voice of God behind the camera.
Let me let Kris take a breath. We're walking down through here. This is actually a break in the two hills. Marye's Heights is actually a series of approximately 5 hills on the western side of the city of Fredericksburg, and we're descending Willis Hill, and we're going down into the sunken road. Off to our left is land owned by the University of Mary Washington. That's Brompton. That's the home of the Marye family. Constructed circa 1824. It's private residence. That's where the president of the college or university lives. We, from time to time, are able to go up there, but you have to go up there with permission. But this is a important part of the story of Second Fredericksburg. This little swale here will actually lead, in May of 1863, Union forces up on top of Marye's Heights and in behind Confederate artillery, some of the Washington Artillery of Louisiana and other units up there. But this is a really cool part of the walking trail up on top of Marye's Heights that you can take.
So as we come down here into the sunken road, I'm going to take us over so we can see where the Irishmen advance. Then I'm going to turn things over to Sarah because she's more interesting than I am.
Are you sure? This is like the third time we teased Sarah.
I know. We're building up anticipation. So here we can see that reconstructed portion of the stone wall that was done in the early 2000s, the Innes House behind us. We'll get up close to that in just a few minutes. We can see some of those bullet holes. Everyone loves to see the bullet holes. All right, if we were to head down the street here, the Irish Brigade was advancing up this way. The brick house that you see on the left side of the road called the Stratton, they're going to come up about that far. You can see the metal roof. There's going to be some gunfire exchange. It's about as close as the Irishmen are able to get. There's a swale in the road down there, and that's going to provide the only bit of cover that's out there. And the Federals are going to either duck down behind the swale and hit the dirt, and it's not much cover. If you poke your head up, you're going to get shot. But it does let them kind of find some sort of cover, and they're going to hide behind the few houses that are dotted out there. And so that's going to be kind of how that second wave is going to exhaust itself. And as these subsequent waves come up over this field, the survivors who are pinned out there will cling to the pant legs of the Federals who are advancing, saying, don't go, you won't survive. And of course I'm not going to survive. You're pulling on my pant legs and breaking my momentum. And so it becomes this self-fulfilling, self-defeating prophecy out there. And now, the woman you've all been waiting for, whom we've teased and teased and teased, is going to tell us a little bit more about what things look like from the Confederate perspective here in the sunken road. Sarah K. Bierle.
Wait, Kris has something else to say.
Gustavus.
Thank you, Kris. And I want to say thank you doubly because he did the walk and talk. I'm recovering from a foot injury. Happy to be here today, but I appreciate the guys letting me take it a bit easy. So, yes, what's happening here with the Confederates? We are standing in the sunken road, as Kris has been telling you about. And so when the fighting begins, when the first advance is made toward this position, there are 3 units holding the sunken road. They're commanded by General Thomas Cobb, and they're going to be the 24th Georgia, the 18th Georgia, and Phillips Legion. Now, as Kris has pointed out, this is a strong position. I'm going to turn a little bit, so hopefully, oh, we might be seeing historical images. But you can see it's a naturally strong position. We've got high ground to what would be my left, and then original wall here to my right. And I think we're back in. All right, I'm getting a nod from Kris White, so I think we did that the right way. And we've got the high ground and the artillery on the high ground. But this position is going to need more reinforcements, and the ways in are somewhat limited because if you've already got units in the road, can you bring more in from the side? could be a little difficult. So when they need to bring reinforcements in, they're going to be coming over the top of the high ground, over Willis Hill, over the house with Brompton, and into the Sunken Road area. So, as I mentioned, the 18th Georgia, the 24th Georgia, and Phillips Legion start off holding the road. There is another regiment in Cobb's brigade, that's the 16th Georgia, and he leaves them in reserve at first. Well, after the Confederates here in the road repulsed that first attack, and as Kris had mentioned, they waited. They let the Union infantry get close. And I was reading some different accounts, and in some regiments, the officers didn't let their men look up over the wall to see the advancing Union soldiers. They just told them, we'll keep watch and we'll tell you when to fire, or I'm paraphrasing a bit there. Other units, it sounds like maybe their troops were allowed to kind of peek over the wall, but the Confederates are waiting, and they let those Union troops get close, and then they unleash what is called a sheet of fire. And the Confederates will use this language, the Union troops coming under this fire use that. So just kind of imagine what that must have been like if you describe the fire coming from these rifles as a sheet of fire. It's very, very deadly, and as Kris said, there's going to be so many casualties out on this field. But while this position is naturally strong, Cobb realizes he's going to need some additional reinforcements. So about the time that the first wave of the attack is repulsed, he starts looking for reinforcements. And he sends a couple of requests because he's not 100% sure who he should be asking. So he sends a request to Lafayette McLaws. He also sends one to General Ransom, and troops start coming into the area. So the first reinforcements to join the Confederates in the Sunken Road is Cook's Brigade of North Carolinians. They're going to come up over the back of Willis Hill, up on that area where we were just a few minutes ago, looking at from the high ground into the town of Fredericksburg. When they get up to that top of Willis Hill, where the artillerymen are, they are coming under fire because Union guns from Stafford side of the river and some other positions are firing onto the Confederate artillery on the high ground. So the infantry is starting to take some losses there, and Cook's brigade comes up a little bit piecemeal. He doesn't come up in one great body, full brigade. So regiments come up a little bit at a time. They're disjointed. They get up to the top of the hill in the 27th North Carolina. They decide to go directly down into the Sunken Road. So they're going to make a dash down the hill and come in on what would be the far side of the Sunken Road from where we're standing now. Other North Carolina regiments will come in to the road as well. Then additional reinforcements will come, more North Carolinians will come on the Brompton side of the high ground. And during the fighting that happens here, 2 brigade commanders are going to be wounded. General Cook is wounded. He has a head wound. He will survive that injury, but about the same time, General Thomas Cobb is also wounded. His is a leg injury, and he is mortally wounded and dies later that day. So they're going to need to bring a new Confederate infantry commander to oversee the fighting that's happening here at the Sunken Road as more and more waves of Union attacks continue to come toward this position. So Joseph Kershaw is going to bring his brigade of South Carolinians to this area, and he will take command of much of the Confederate fighting here in this area. Someone else have things they want to add?
One of the things that I like about this area of the battlefield is it's rich in resources. A lot of times people go to a battlefield, for instance, if you go out to Spotsylvania, it's like, oh, look at that beautiful field. Here you've got monuments, you've got structures, you've got some natural beauty. Brompton behind us, you can see, as Kris mentioned earlier, that's where the president of the University of Marye, Washington lives. There's battle damage that is still in the front of that structure. We've got photographs that show what things look like. Sisson's store was down here off to my left. Behind the camera, we'll swing around just briefly. We can see the Angel of Marie's Heights. We'll talk about Richard Kirkland in just a few minutes. We've got the Innes House. We've got some monuments. We talked a little bit about Thomas Cobb, and he's going to be killed on this battlefield, on this road, within sight of his mother's childhood home. And so there are lots of different things that we can look at and talk about, and stories that we can tell, and resources that really connect us to this history. I'm going to give you one story that really has nothing to do with the battle, but it's my favorite story from this part of the battlefield. One summer when I was working here as a park ranger, I came out and there was a car parked on the crest of the hill right here. And I'm like, what are you doing with the car? And this couple had lost their exotic parrot, which was flying around in the bushes. And this was apparently a multi-$1,000 parrot. And they were worried about their lost pet. And I'm like, you can't park here. And they're like, well, we've got to get our parrot. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. You can't park right here. I mean, literally, like on the edge of the road. So then I threatened to call the park security, the park rangers. And they were like, got all indignant that I would not be cared about their parrot. And I'm like, this is a wall that is original and historic. Some people not caring about history at all, but they love their parrots. Kris has his microphone now with some short stories to share as well.
Yeah, I think the important thing to remember is that this is a neighborhood. And thanks for watching. We have a lot of people who are following us. I see Perryopolis, Pennsylvania. It's another place near where I'm from. We have some questions. I'm going to throw this one out to Dan and Kris afterwards, after I'm done. But did the Irish Brigade actually fight Irish Confederates? It was something we were making fun of before we started this live. We have somebody who has 4 ancestors in the 7th Indiana, who were down at the other end of the field. They were lucky ones. They didn't see a lot of action here at Fredericksburg. I see that Gary Alderman guy showing back up. Kris, you should get a Genesee beer. That somebody gave you a shout out there. We have people from Illinois, Georgia, all over the place. But I think it's important to remember that, as Kris was pointing out, you know, there's a lot of resources here. Why is that? We're at the edge of the city of Fredericksburg in 1862. The sunken road was a living, breathing entity. This was also known as the Telegraph Road. It was the I-95 of its day. It's going to lead you 50 miles north of Washington and 55 miles south down to Richmond, Virginia. So what you have here is one of the 2 major thoroughfares that Ambrose Burnside, the Union Army commander, wants to capture. He also wants to capture the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. Well, the Telegraph Road here is being utilized as a forward position by the Confederates. It's actually a salient point, a point of their line that protrudes outward. In fact, if the Federals could get in on the either side of this, they actually would cut off Cobb's brigade. But to the north of us, we have Gordon's Marsh. To the south of us, we have Hazel Run. Out in front, we have the Mill Race. So it's really a very fortified position. But behind Sarah is the House of Brompton, constructed in 1824, circa 1824. And that is the Marye family home. For your useless piece of information, for the Battle of Gettysburg, and this is a shout out to Gary, the first Confederate artillery battery to fire at Gettysburg was the Fredericksburg Artillery, led by Edward Marye, who lived in that home prior to, during, and after the Civil War. But they're not the only ones living here. This was a neighborhood. Over here, the National Park Service has put up an interpretive panel as well as some stone slabs to show you the Ebert store. They're a German family who came here and had a store. We had Sarah Sisson's house, which is today the Sunken Well Tavern, just on the other side of those trees. That's a historic structure. On the other side of this White House, which is non-historic, is a historic structure known as the Stratton House, circa 1857-58. That house was described as a perfect blue beehive of activity because it was one place that the Federals could get behind. Someone was talking about the swale that's out in front. Because we are loser historians, we went out and walked it out. It's 92 yards from where we're standing. So if you go out there, you would go out about 92 yards and make it out to the Stratton House, which would give these men some cover. We also would have the home of Martha Stevens. She actually goes by 3 different aliases: Martha Stevens, Martha Innes, and Martha Farrow. Her house, allegedly, that's a house that she would rent out, was allegedly a cat house. We don't really have any hard evidence about that, but she was running an illegal bar out of her home, which was the next home down the road. It burns by fire. She claims that she stayed here the entire time, but she has no basement, and there were about 2,500 bullet and shell holes through it, so she probably did not stay here. But the Confederates, after the war, will kind of rally around her. They like her a lot. Then where the Fredericksburg Battlefield Visitor Center is today, it's not a historic structure, but it's created to look like one in the 1930s. Would have been the 2.5-story Hall House, which was, again, turned into Swiss cheese by 2 different battles that took place here. So this was a neighborhood, a very popular and prominent neighborhood. And in fact, we did the archaeological dig out here for the National Park Service to see what we could find in the trash pit of Martha Stevens. I think, and I'm just working off without notes, I think it was 500 pounds of oyster shells and champagne bottles they found in there. So she was running a very wealthy, or very successful establishment. Thanks, Kris. Cold medicine has got me not thinking. But this is the only original portion of the wall that we have here. This is a retaining wall. The wall that Kris was pointing out as we came down here is more of a freestanding wall, and there'll be another one out that way. After the war, Some people will come through here and take pieces of the wall as a memento. If you go to the West Virginia State Science Museum in Charleston, West Virginia, there's actually stones from various Civil War battlefields. You can see that's carved in it, and one of them is Fredericksburg. And it could come right from this wall here. We don't know. And we'll have another piece of the wall the Civilian Conservation Corps will put in the 1930s. So this was a living, breathing area, and up until the early 2000s, this was a major thoroughfare. This was a street, this was a city street, and if you came out here to give tours or if you were touring, all you had was right along here was a sidewalk to walk along, and then you had a one-way street, not always used was one way by some college students, going down through here. I think it was 25 miles an hour. One of our former rangers told me that they clocked people going through here at 50 and 60 miles an hour some nights whenever the city street was still open. So this was shut down. The road was refurbished. They used digitized photographs, archaeological digs to bring everything back to the way it looks today. In fact, the stone wall that was reconstructed by the government contractor, and this is not something you always hear about a government contractor, was so well done that the chief historian at the park had him take it down and beat it up to make it look a little bit more rough. So this is a really cool piece of history. So some people who haven't been here since about 2005 have never seen this road shut down. So now you can access it today and come into it just like the Confederates would have. Yeah.
And I'm about to step into a hornet's nest and answer the question that one of our viewers just posed to us regarding the Irish here at Fredericksburg. There are men, Irish immigrants, men of Irish descent, who are in Thomas Cobb's Georgia Brigade that is defending the stone wall. We talked a little bit, obviously, about the attack of the Irish Brigade commanded by Thomas Francis Marye, regiments from New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, who were largely of Irish descent or Irish immigrants. Now, whether or not Cobb's Georgians knew who they were fighting, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Many of the regiments, in fact, in the Irish Brigade, especially the New York regiments, had sent their green flags of Erin back home to be repaired. They've been so damaged by the battles of 1862. The 28th Massachusetts is a new regiment in the Irish Brigade. They are carrying a green flag. The 116th Pennsylvania, Marye said they could not carry a green flag because, in his eyes, they did not have a very high number of Irish immigrants or men of Irish descent in their ranks. So the major identifier, those green flags are not with the unit here on December 13th, 1862. Now, did the event that is portrayed in the movie Gods and Generals take place regarding the Irishmen shooting down one another? Probably not. We get that account from a fellow named George Pickett. Where's George Pickett on December 13th? He's roughly a few miles off to the south in the center of the Confederate position, probably never even laid eyes on the attacks that took place here against Marye's Heights. So no, as it is portrayed in the movie, no, it probably did not happen that way. And I'm going to now turn it back over to Kris.
A couple questions from folks. Just want to answer them real fast. The monument behind us, that is to Richard Rowland Kirkland. He's known as the Angel of Marye's Heights. He's a member of the 2nd South Carolina Infantry, goes over top of the wall. There's various accounts. Did he go over? Didn't he go over? How many times did he go over? Regardless, he has a monument that was placed here in 1964. It was created by Felix de Weldon. He's the sculptor. If you look at the style, if you ever look at any pictures of this, it will look very similar to another memorial up in Arlington National Cemetery, and that is to the Iwo Jima Memorial. Some people call it that, but as the Marine Corps Memorial. It's also a smaller one outside of Marine Corps Base Quantico, about 20 miles up the road from us. So that was one of the questions that we had. Had a couple other questions that came through. If we found any dead parrots, no, we did not. Let's see, original stone wall. Yes, that's what's behind us here. Was the neighborhood always this close? No, it was not always this close. In the time of the war, it's about 900 yards, but by the end of the 20th century, it was already creeping right up to the edge of the park. And then back here, Confederates do take about 1,000 casualties on this end of the battlefield. Most of the casualties are not sustained in the road. They're actually sustained on the heights. In fact, the deadliest knoll probably is that knoll where this tree sits, and that is where the 7th South Carolina will be positioned. They will lose a number of commanders in just 10 minutes because anytime they went out there to expose themselves, they were hit. Why is that? The Federals who are pinned down in front have very low targets over here. Only chest and maybe heads of some of these Confederate soldiers are here, but silhouetted against the sky are those Confederates on top of the hill. So in fact, the safest place to be would be down into here. So when the Confederates bring in reinforcements and they need to replenish their ammunition, all they do is move entire brigades down into this road. They rush down into here. Some men will stand in front and fire. Others in the rear will load. Men in the middle will pass forward unloaded and loaded muskets, and they will keep up a constant ring of fire. One Confederate said that he fired so many times that day that his body was black and blue from his right elbow to his right hip for the next few weeks. So they're doing a lot of shooting out here. So this whole area would have been the place where most people would think you would want to be, not down in here in this road, actually was the safer place because the Federals can't advance close enough, and they also don't have the targets of opportunity that they have up on top of the hill. And if you know anything about Civil War firearms, most of the American Civil War soldiers aimed high. They would always, the officers admonish their men, aim low so that they would actually lower their muskets. So being up on that exposed hill was not the place to be.
Now that you've said Ring of Fire, all I can think of is Johnny Cash here at the Battle of Fredericksburg. So thanks for that little earworm. So as the Federals continue their pressure against this position, perhaps it's logical to think, if they're pinned out there and they see reinforcements coming from the top of the hill down into this road, well, maybe if we keep the pressure up, we can break through. They're having to send reinforcements. We must be doing something. But in fact, those Federals don't realize that these guys are coming down with more bullets, more ammunition. The Confederates are able to put up that sheet of fire that Sarah mentioned earlier that's so intense they're running out of ammunition. But these Federal assaults keep coming up against this position for a couple other reasons as well. First of all, Burnside is expecting William B. Franklin to be pushing his attack at the south end of the field. And as we talked about earlier, that goes nowhere. Franklin calls it off and doesn't tell Burnside. So Burnside keeps up these attacks in an effort to tie these Confederates down so that they can't intervene down there, not knowing that that attack has been called off. Also, if you stop exerting pressure against this position, Confederates could, in theory, come up over the wall and have a counterattack. The best way to defend against a counterattack is to keep up pressure of your own. So these attacks continue. Burnside unaware that things at the south end of the field have gone awry. When he orders those attacks to resume, they don't. So finally, the last attack here happens at the far end of the sunken road, where where Federals are sweeping up through an abandoned railroad cut, jump out, push forward, go huzzah as they yell across the field, giving away their position in the twilight. And Confederate gunners on the top of the hill blast those Federals off the field. And that's going to end the fighting for the day. We're going to walk down here just a little bit further because we have a tour group coming and we want to stay out of the way of all of our fine friends here at the National Park Service as they're doing their anniversary duties as well. You're watching the American Battlefield Trust. Please share, please like, please let your friends know that you are spreading the gospel of preservation here at Fredericksburg for the 160th anniversary. Behind the camera, we have Kris White, Dan Davis, Sarah Bierle. I'm Chris Mackowski. Here we can see the swale down in that direction, the Stratton House, which we'd mentioned before, the Irishmen advancing up in this direction. So nightfall comes, brings an end to the fighting. And Burnside is entirely perplexed about what to do next. He's going to come across the river, confer with his subordinates, talk to other commanders, try to find what his alternatives are. And there are many accounts. Darius Couch, for instance, talks about Burnside just barely holding it together. And it's not that he's panicked. It's that he's heartbroken. He realizes the sacrifice that has happened out here. And he wants to find some way to make it right, some way to redeem what has gone on here. And so he's going to come up with a plan to lead his 9th Corps personally up this road to advance against the sunken road. And he thinks that these are men who have followed him through the course of the war. They're personally loyal to him. He's had great success with them. They'll follow him to the gates of hell itself. They'll follow him up here. But none of his subordinates feel that he would be successful. And it takes Bull Sumner, the oldest general in the Union Army, to pull him aside. And he's the one who has to break the news to Burnside that no one thinks that that's a successful plan. And Burnside says that if it had been anybody else, he wouldn't have listened to him. But Sumner, who was always willing to go forward, if he, who was always willing to fight, said something could not be done, then it could not be done. And so a teary-eyed Burnside will call off that assault for the morning of the 14th. The day instead will pass with Federals trapped out there behind the swale, trading pot shots with Confederates who are in the sunken road behind you. And that's when Richard Kirkland fills up canteens from the well at Martha Stevenson's, comes across the hill and comes out here to administer mercy to the fallen. And as Kris said, there's some controversy about that myth. But I think what it illustrates is something really important, that in the midst of this chaos and in the midst of this slaughter, there are still acts of humanity, acts of compassion, acts of mercy.
Yeah, I just want to answer a few questions from folks on the internet here. So I want to thank some folks who are donating over on YouTube. We really appreciate it. That's how we are going to fund these video swings as well as preserve battlefield land. But someone was asking about the 15th South Carolina Infantry. Where did they fight? Right over top of where we were standing. They're right down here in the sunken road. That's Joseph Kershaw's brigade of South Carolinians. They're part of Lafayette McLaws' division of the Confederate First Army Corps. Someone was asking about some of the fences that were out here. Although there would have been actually 3 bridges leading across a canal ditch that was out here. The planks would have been torn up from those, and there would have been runners left over them, the bridge runners, so that one man at a time would have to run across those, and the Confederates would pre-sight those. There would be some fences that were left up. There's a fairgrounds that some people are asking about. That's Mercer Square. It would have been just off in this direction by a couple hundred yards. It was actually a Confederate training camp. But Fredericksburg boasts one of the oldest agricultural fairs in the United States. The fairgrounds today are about 2 miles south of where we are, down near the Slaughter Pen Farm. So you can go down there to visit the Fredericksburg Fairgrounds. But at the time, Mercer Square was actually a fenced-in fairgrounds, and the Confederates will take down parts of the fences but leave up some. At least the ones closest to them. So as the Federals got closer and closer and started kicking those fences in or trying to take them down, they knew that they had targets of opportunity out in front of them. So this was a prepared position here at Marye's Heights. So there's a lot more questions that we have on here. I could answer them all day. You know, whose fault was it? Was it Burnside, Lincoln, someone else's fault here?
I'm going to give it to Lincoln, honestly.
Kris gives it to Lincoln. Charles Wainwright, First Corps artillerist, gives it to Lincoln and the bloodthirsty politicians, as he puts it, to paraphrase him. So those are some of the things we had here. We really appreciate you watching, and I'm going to turn it over to Dan Davis, who's behind the camera now. We're going to do a little swap and bring him on. He says some things that he wants to say about the Fredericksburg campaign.
Yeah, one of the things before we wrap up here today is that I would like to challenge each and every one of you who's watching. Think about this campaign for just a moment, but not only think about the campaign within the context of December of 1862, but look at it within the context of the course of the entire conflict. Robert E. Lee here will have his easiest victory. It's a one-sided victory. He inflicts over 13,000 casualties on the Union Army here. He himself suffers roughly about 6,000 casualties, a ratio of roughly about 2 to 1. It's his biggest victory over the Union Army here in Virginia. But look at this from a larger perspective. What do we have between Fredericksburg and, say, 2 years later, December 15th and 16th of 1864, we have the Confederate loss at Gettysburg. Vicksburg has fallen. Atlanta has fallen. Lee is bottled up around Richmond and Petersburg. But on December the 15th and December the 16th, John Bell Hood's Army of Tennessee is nearly annihilated and routed off the field by George Thomas at the Battle of Nashville. Look at how high the Confederacy is flying here in December of 1862 compared to how low and how the sun is setting on the Confederacy in December of 1864. Lee's greatest victory over the Union Army versus a major catastrophe for the Confederate Army of Tennessee. And you could probably make an argument, and I would challenge you to think about this a little bit more. Is Fredericksburg the real high water mark of the Civil War and for the Confederacy? And I'm going to turn it back over to Kris Mackowski.
So, as the Union Army had arrayed itself in all its martial splendor in the south end of the field, Robert E. Lee was watching them in their deployment. He actually couldn't see the action here because of the topography and the hills that were in his way, but he could see everything that was going on the south end of the field. And as he watched the banners unfurl and the bayonets glinting in the morning light and these large waves of blue sweeping across the field, he turned to an aide and he said, "It is a good thing war is so terrible, or we should grow too fond of it." The career military man in him couldn't help but be stirred by the sight that he saw in front of him. But here, particularly on this ground where we're standing at, we know that this is not war so terrible. The Federals suffer some 13,000 casualties here, compared to only about 5,000 or 6,000 Confederate casualties. Here at the north end of the field, there are going to be 8,000 Federals across that field behind us, compared to only about 1,000 Confederates, where it was close to one-on-one down at the south end of the field. On the night of December 14th, the Northern Lights come out as these men are trapped out here in the battlefield and the temperature gets down into the low 30s. And they're stacking up bodies around them to try to huddle against, find some sort of warmth. And the Federals see this as God paying testament to the brave sacrifice of their fallen comrades. The Confederates, meanwhile, see this as God celebrating their tremendous victory. But it's not a tremendous victory. It is what Robert E. Lee had said earlier that day. Is war so terrible? And it's hard for us sometimes to really feel the scope of that when we have neighborhoods that have encroached across these hallowed grounds. And that's why when you save these hallowed grounds, it becomes so vital, because it gives us footsteps that we can walk in, places we can touch and connect and understand our history and see what happened and pay tribute to the events that took place there today, 160 years ago. We invite you to come here to Fredericksburg. We invite you to visit any Civil War battlefield that you can, so that you can be in touch with your own history and understand these stories for yourselves. We encourage you to go to battlefields.org, help support the work that we at the American Battlefield Trust are doing to preserve these places. You can take advantage of the many resources there, not only videos like this, but hundreds and hundreds of hours of other videos you can watch. Got fantastic sets of maps, exceptional articles, and of course you've got that Gary Adel fella that you can also tap into there as well. We'd love to have your support. We appreciate everything you do to help us with battlefield preservation. For Kris White behind the camera, for Dan Davis, for Sarah K. Bierle, I'm Chris Mackowski. Thanks for being with us here in the Fredericksburg 160th at the American Battlefield Trust, and thank you for supporting battlefield preservation.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. Get inspired at battlefields.org.